In a strange castle, a floating creature reads the history of powerful individuals who created magic and mana to a little boy, but the ignorant brat keeps interrupting the reading. As a result, he scolds the boy for being annoying and continues his reading. The floating creature is Gus the Ghost and a little eccentric, but he is smarter than anyone else and teaches the little boy, Will, many things. After the reading, Gus shows Will a fire magic trick, and it startles Will, but also impresses him. Later that day, Will walks around a room of statues and mentions the names of the powerful individuals they represent. However, he feels strangely connected to one of them, Gracefeel, and soon enough, a lady cosplaying the symbol of justice walks up behind him. She then tells Will about Gracefeel, who was a son of Volt, a lightning master, and the Earth Mother Matter. The lady, Mary, happens to pray to the Earth Mother every day because she is in charge of child rearing and the bounties of the earth. After the brief homeschooling, she decides it's time for lunch, and Will, the glutton, is excited about it. Suddenly, a buffed-up skeleton with a bad haircut, Blood, comes in with juicy boar meat, and Will greets him. Afterward, they have a steak dinner, and Blood promises to teach Will how to hunt when he gets older. However, the prospect of taking lives is a sensitive topic to Will, and Mary scolds Blood for being ignorant. Gus also joins in, but he instead praises Will for being a genius like him. Soon, Blood starts arguing with him, and while they argue, Will asks Mary about where she bakes the bread they eat, but she tells him it's a secret. Will seems disheartened that the 3 undead creatures who he has lived with since a baby are keeping lots of things from him, but he also is keeping his secret from them, which is that he has memories of his past life. A few years back, as a baby, Will opened his eyes to see 3 scary-looking monsters about to take his life. However, he was surprised when they coddled him up instead. A few months later, Mary takes him outside the castle, and Will loves the scenery. He then thanks his grace for being given another opportunity to live, and this time, he promises not to throw it all away. 7 years later, Will is getting schooled by Blood, under the pretense of strength training, since we all know Blood looks for any opportunity to whoop his ass. After muscle training with Blood, Will moves on to magic training with Gus, but the fool's pronunciation is too precise, which leads to his inability to control his accuracy. Along the way, their discussion leads to money, and Will wonders why Gus is such a money-grubbing ghost. At night, Mary teaches him about beasts and demons that live in hell. She then tells him the reason they're undead, which was as a result of them clinging to powerful emotions when they died, leading them to form a contract with the demon of the undead. The next day, Will pulls a David stunt and hunts down a bird. However, he finds it difficult to end his life, and afterward, he tells Blood that he doesn't like killing. Blood then tells him it is a necessary sustenance to keep himself alive, and he must go for the kill reflexively during life or death situations. The next day, Will trains with both Gus and Blood in both magic and strength training. To show his progress, he engages in a spar with Blood, but even with his magic prowess, Blood still spanks his hard. Afterward, Blood praises Will for his skills, and also tells him a little about themselves. Gus used to be called the Wandering Sage, who exterminated monsters and rediscovered ancient languages. Blood used to be called the War Ogre, and Mary was known as the Daughter of Matter. However, Gus makes a comment that Blood thinks might be offensive to Will, and as a result, Gus apologizes to Will. On the way back to the castle, Blood acts like an old uncle to Will, and promises to tell him everything about their existence once he's big and strong like a bear. Will then hugs Blood from behind as an act of appreciation, but the big bloke thinks it's a sneak attack and batters the poor kid instead. The next day, Will helps Mary out in the garden, but she suddenly tells him to take care of things while she goes inside the dorm to pray. For some reason, Will isn't allowed in the dome while Mary prays, and during his wonder, Blood comes to drag him away for physical training. Later in the night, Will wanders in the castle after a day of hard training, and he sees Mary coming out of the temple with a loaf of bread. He then remembers how she told him the baking of the bread was a secret, and his curiosity kicked up a notch. Will follows Mary to a door, but after opening it, he sees her burning in a blue flame. An instinct not to lose anyone he loves again kicks in, and Will rushes into the fire, burning his hands in the process. Later that day, Will lies on his bed with his hands bandaged, and the 3 undead creatures watch over him. Luckily for him, his hands will heal up, but scarring will be unavoidable. He then wakes up and calls Mary, who blames herself for putting him in danger. Will then apologizes for being a nosy prat, and Blood makes him promise to always consult with any of them before doing anything. Gus then tells him that the bread is a gift from the Earth Mother Matter, and because Mary had previously betrayed the Earth Mother by forming a contract with Stagnate, the Earth Mother's enemy, coming in contact with matter causes her to burn. Despite this, Mary continues to pray to Mater because she must endure pain and retribution, and she must continue to revere the Earth Mother. Also, the fact that Mater keeps blessing her with bread for him every day is more than enough saving grace for her. She then apologizes for not telling him, and hopes he'll continue to eat the bread. The glutton agrees, and then makes her promise to let him join her during her prayers because he wants to understand what Mary sees and feels, even if it's only a little. In the study room, Gus educates Will about the age of war among powerful beings that destroyed the original world. He further tells Will about the distinction between evil, powerful beings and virtuous, powerful beings. However, Will, who is a smartass, calls it all a fable, and Gus appreciates his wisdom. A few years later, Mary commends Will for completing his 5-day silent prayer, where he just sat like a lazy dog doing nothing. Newsflash, Will is now 13 years, and he wears his burn scar like a badge of honor. Also, Gus's lessons have become more difficult for him, but he sticks with it for all he is worth. However, the lesson becomes more intense and Gus wants to quit and give up like a little bitch. Sadly, Blood doesn't let up on him either, and his training is a lot harder. During training, Blood tells him to fight a low-budget demon's corpse, but Will whimpers like a little girl and cries for his mummy. Then, he decides to summon courage and face the skeleton, and in a swift manner, he defeats the corpse. Happy with himself, Will celebrates his victory in front of Blood, but Blood seems very surprised. Blood then calls him a genius, but throws him a deal to speed things up and try something harder. Following that, they head into the city, and this is the first time Will step into the ruined city he always saw from the castle. Soon, they enter a pathway into a tunnel underground, which looks like a scene from a bad horror movie. In the tunnel, Blood informs Will that the place is filled with mindless, wandering undead, which makes it a danger zone. Afterward, Blood tells Will to find his way out of the tunnel before he dips, leaving Will with only himself to blame. To see what's around him, Will uses to light up his shield, and not long after, unwanted dead guests decide to visit him. Will then unsheathes his sword and decides to fight the frauds like a gladiator. After defeating them, Will replenishes his strength by drinking some water before continuing his journey to the end of the tunnel. He has this resolve to become a pupil that his teacher can be proud of. Moments later, he sights a dinosaur-looking skeleton with an oddly shaped skull which he recognizes as a Vrascus demon. The Vrascus demon is known to be able to use words and is stronger than the low-budget corpses he had faced earlier. He then contemplates whether to dip like a coward or fight like a man. After a little deliberation, he walks up to the Vrascus holding his shield up high like Captain America and engages in a duel with it. During the fight, the demon casts a spell, but Will quickly cancels it and strikes it on the head. Sadly, his sword breaks but cracks the oddly shaped skull of the Vrascus demon. Then, Will picks up the Vrascus demon's weapon, which happens to be a dwarf magic spear, and continues his journey to the light. During his wandering, Will thinks about who his real parents are and how he came into the company of his 3 undead foster parents. Suddenly, a fog appears, and Will sees Gus within it. He then approaches Gus, but Gus glares at him like he stole his bread. Gus then attacks Will by summoning a golem, but Will aims for the rune and destroys the golem. However, Gus doesn't relent, and he keeps launching spells at poor Will, who would have run to Bel Air if he had the chance. Will then changes his mind and decides to attack Gus with his spear, but he can't go through with it and stops halfway. He then drops his spear and pleads with Gus to just end him, because fighting him will make him feel worse than dying. Tears start to drop from his eyes, but Gus plays it off like a big joke and a lesson. However, his reaction makes Will think that there's something more to his existence and the city than meets the eye. At the castle, Mary, Blood, and Gus are proud of Will for finding himself a fine spear beneath the ruined city. Gus then offers to teach Will several lessons involving the spear. However, Will has decided not to tell Blood and Mary about what happened at the tunnel because he thinks Gus must have his reason for doing what he did. Afterward, Will starts to train with his spear, and he even names Pale Moon, like a Game of Thrones character. He also masters how to emit light from the spear like a Jedi, and also expand or shorten the spear at will. With the experience gained, Will enters the ruined city regularly for training with Blood, and he collects the weapons and armor he finds. Later in the study room, Gus gives Will a few books to read, and before leaving, he informs Will that he will enter the city underground and collect coins, which he will use to give him a very important lesson. Later that day, Will brings back a buttload of coins, and Gus decides to teach Will a lesson. Blood is also with them, and it turns out all Gus wants to do is to gamble with coins. Will refuses to gamble at first, but after much teasing, he gives in. However, during their gambling, Mary enters the room and punishes them for acting like a bunch of money-grubbing goofs. Through Mary's lecture, Will learned that getting hooked on gambling is bad for business. A year later, Gus discusses with Will his coming-of-age ritual because he'll soon turn 15. In the ritual, Blood will challenge him to a one-on-one sword fight, which is an earnest duel. After hearing this, Will promises to do his best to kick Blood's ass, but to his surprise, Gus tells him to lose the duel in a way that Blood won't notice. This request upsets Will, who claims that Gus is always keeping him away from the truth. He then asks Gus to explain his reason, but the dickhead refuses to. As a result, Will refuses his request and walks out of the room angry. In the temple, Will stares at the statues, and soon, Mary and Blood approach him. For the ritual, Will has to swear an oath to a powerful being to follow, and Mary suggests he chooses Volt, the master of lightning. However, Blood tells him not to swear an oath in the heat of the moment because he will suffer many hardships in exchange. This advice makes Will think for a while about a decision to make. Afterward, Mary gives Will a haircut, and she is a lot better than whoever in hell cuts Blood's hair. She then tells Will about how manly Blood used to look as a human, and now his face too has started to look like that of a man. The next day, Blood decides to have a drink with Will, and also prepare him for his journey as an adult. Will initially doesn't want to upset Mary, but Blood tells him they'll keep it a secret from that upright nun. Blood and Will gulp down a few drinks, and surprisingly, the drink is a good one. Later that day, the two drunken fools decide to have a peek at Mary while she changes, which of course is Blood's idea. They open the door to Mary's room and peek at her while she undresses. Unfortunately, Will goes a step too far, and the dumbass barges into the room, startling Mary. Mary then realizes they were both drunk, and Blood confesses their intention. Afterward, Mary lands a painful slap on Will's face, and even Blood could feel it. The next morning, Will wakes up with a giant palm mark on his face and also some jizz in his pants. Seeing Mary undress must have triggered his first wet dream, and while he washes his clothes, Blood makes fun of him. On the day of the duel, Will trains a bit and remembers Gus's request for him to throw the duel. Soon, Mary comes to him with his battle kit and asks him if he has finally decided on which powerful being he wants to swear an oath to. Will then replies that he has an idea, which one, and also proclaims that he will win his duel. After putting on his battle armor and looking like a knight ordained by Lord Farquaad, Will meets with Blood, who is itching to kick his butt. Blood then gives him a rule of not using magic during the duel, and Will accepts. The battle begins, and Blood draws first blood. As a result of Blood's strength and prowess, Will goes into defense mode and waits for an opportunity to strike. Soon, an opportunity shows, and Will throws a knife at Blood as a decoy, but Blood reads his trick like the seasoned warrior he is. With creative thinking, Will figures out a way to bypass Blood's rapid sword swings and goes for it. He successfully knocks Blood down and attempts to finish him off. However, Blood cheats by trapping Will's sword in his ribs and turns the tables on Will's ass. Will then concedes, but Mary rushes and scolds Blood for using the same trick he used when he was human. Will is surprised to hear this and wonders how he managed to survive having a sword trapped in his ribs. He survived due to Mary, and they soon start to argue, and Will knows best not to butt in on their quarrel. Afterward, Blood commends Will for trying his best, even though his weak couldn't win. He then gives him a sword called Overeater and tells him the wielder of the sword gets stronger whenever it cuts a living being. However, he warns Will not to use the sword abruptly because he might become over-dependent on it and turn into a retarded zombie. Then, he decides to tell Will about their world just like he promised to when he was younger. Blood tells Will about the tale of the High King among demon kings who tried to conquer their continent. The High King was a powerful demon, and 200 years ago, he led a demon in a great uprising in which an army of countless demons invaded their continent of Southmark. The whole continent crawled with ugly and disgusting demons who offered up massive amounts of flesh and blood in many rituals to their liege, the Master of Dimensions. As a result, the minions of the Master of Tyranny, Ill-Treat, and those of the Master of the Undead, Stagnate, became active all over the world. The virtuous masters also expended a great deal of strength in a series of intense battles with the demons, which ended up changing the geography of the continent. However, the High King went on a rampage in Southmark, and he's so powerful that he could turn any blood he shed into soldiers, and any flesh cut from his body turn into commanders. His weapon was the Overeater, and he would laugh like the Joker while he created armies by cutting down enemies and getting cut himself. Soon, the High King conquered the city and made it his home. He also mass-produced demons, which used the water roots to attack surrounding settlements. While everyone thought it was over for Southmark, Gus suggested that it was the perfect time to take down the High King. Will wonders why Gus would come to such a conclusion. But after a bit of thinking, he figured out the plan was to steal the Overeater from the High King. Although he had the right idea, his conclusion was wrong, and Blood tells him that they weren't able to defeat the High King. The High King turned into a grotesque creature, and Blood couldn't even get a scratch on him because the High King was the better swordsman. Blood still wonders what it was he lacked back then, but there's nothing he can do about it now, since he's now an undead. After realizing they were bound to lose, Mary and Gus sealed the High King beneath the land. However, Stagnate appears, and he isn't too happy with what has happened at Southmark, but he thought it would be better to keep the High King sealed. So, he offered them a deal to become undead and fight on his side, and in exchange, he'd get rid of the smelly demons in the city. Although, it might look like they had a choice, they didn't have any other but to accept Stagnate's hands. As a result, Blood turned into a skeleton, Mary turned into a mummy, and Gus turned into a ghost. Afterward, the low-budget demons brought Will along as a sacrifice meant to break the High King's seal, but they defeated the demons and argued a bit with Gus on whether to keep him. Mary then tells him there must be a place inhabited by humans close by, and he has to do now to find them. Then they bid Will farewell, and he wonders why it seems like he wouldn't see them again. Suddenly, Stagnate appears from the sky and asks for both their souls. For some reason, Will couldn't move, but Gus appeared out of the blue and promised to stop Stagnate. Gus engages in a fierce battle with Stagnate, and his magic prowess amazes Will. Using a powerful magic spell that only a group of magic users can cast, Gus traps Stagnate in a ball of chains like a black slave and destroys him in an explosion. Afterward, he rushes to Will and tries to calm him down, saying everything would be fine. However, Stagnate strikes Gus from behind like a Pusio and praises himself for splitting his body into two beforehand. He then defeats the undead and walks up to Will, who is devastated at this point. Stagnate then tells him that the undead formed contracts with him and became the highest ranked undead with the condition that they will become his servants when they lose their attachment to the High King. Thanks to him, their attachment to the High King has weakened, and both Mary and Blood have completely lost their attachment. He then commends Will for living well as their son, and asks him to join his army to continue living with his beloved foster parents. He then gives him until the next evening for an answer, before flying off like Homelander. In the castle, Will arranges the body of the undead and blames himself for their demise. He cries and apologizes to them for being a useless like he was in his past life. The next day, Will wakes up and sees his three foster parents smiling at him. They then start to assure Will about their well-being and make subtle jokes about their encounter with Stagnate. However, Will isn't buying their crap and confesses to them about having memories of his past life. He then calls himself garbage and blames himself for bringing bad luck to them. Suddenly, Mary slaps him and scolds him for calling himself garbage just because Stagnate upset him. She then tells him to stop putting himself down and commands him to stand upright like a US Marine. As a result of Mary's scolding, Will finally lets go of his inferiority complex and accepts himself for who he is. With his newfound self-esteem, he offers to protect them from Stagnate and heads over to the temple to ask for strength from the virtuous masters. At night, Will heads out with his spear and meets with Stagnate, who demands an answer from him. Will responds to his request by telling him to s**k his mom and go back to the hell he came from. Stagnate gets angry at his comment and summons demon corpses, and they surround Will. Will decides to take them all on like an esteemed warrior and holds his ground against the multitude. However, he can also do so much as a human, and he ends up getting subdued by the corpses. Stagnate at this point is impressed by Will, and he asks for his name. After Will tells him, Stagnate makes another offer to join him as a general of his undead army. As the icing on the cake, he'll be able to live with his three foster parents happily and be free of death forever. As Stagnate makes this offer, Will feels that he might be telling the truth, but knows for a fact that Stagnate wanks to his voice every night. Then Stagnate cuts himself and offers his blood to Will, who walks over to him to take him on his offer. Psych, Will reverses Uno on Stagnate's ass and cuts him with Overeater. Will cuts Stagnate a few more times, but just before landing the finish, he gets bitten by a snake and he collapses. With Will's actions and that of Gus from earlier, Stagnate decides to never let his guard down around them again. In a strange place, Will wakes up and wonders if he has died. He realizes that the environment seems familiar, like he has walked through there before, and suddenly, he sees a lady with a torch. Will then bows his head and calls her the Master of Light. After seeing her, he remembers that he had walked under the starry sky once before, and the Master of Light's footsteps were filled with care and compassion. She then asks Will why he rejected Stagnate's invitation. Will explains that he was a pathetic shut-in in his past life, and whenever anything got him down, he never bothered to get back up. After living such a pathetic life, he realizes that being alive and not being dead isn't the same thing. As a result of that, he decided to live a good life in this world, and by living right, he could die right. Denying death like Stagnate promised and living forever wouldn't be different from being locked in that room in his past life. All he wants now is to live and die as part of the same family as his foster parents. After hearing his reason, the Master of Light, Gracefield, stretches her hand to Will and he takes it. She then tells him to wake up and make his oath so they can walk together. She offers to become his guardian liege until his life ends and she comes to guide him again. Afterward, Will wakes up and Stagnate laughs hysterically at him. Will then prays to Gracefield and asks her to walk by his side. After seeing him pray, Stagnate thinks Will is asking for the blessing, but to his surprise, Will starts burning with divine fire. He then offers his life to Gracefield and promises to be her sword to banish evil, as well as her hand to save the suffering. Stagnate then realizes Will has already cupped the divine protection of Gracefield, and he is pained. He then sends his army after Will, but with the power now bestowed upon Will, he clears out the demons in one strike with the divine torch. Stagnate gets upset by this, and Will accelerates toward him. However, Stagnate leaps into the sky and sends an explosion at Will. Luckily, Will avoids it, but he can't find Stagnate anywhere. He thinks that Stagnate has the desire to end him and stays on guard. However, he gets tapped by Gracefeel, and she shows him another direction. Suddenly, Will realizes that Stagnate was only bluffing, and his real targets were Blood and Mary. Will quickly accelerated toward the temple with the hope of saving them both. He feels that he can finally free his foster parents from the grip Stagnate has on them, now that he has the divine power of Gracefeel. In a flash, Will breaks into the temple and he sees Stagnate ready to take Blood and Mary's souls after pasting Gus into the wall like concrete. Will then rushes toward him, but he isn't able to reach faster than Stagnate can claim their souls. Suddenly, Stagnate gets burned by Earth Mother Matter as he tries to claim Mary's soul. This makes Will realize that Mary's liege master never resented her, but only waited for Mary to be able to forgive herself. As a result of this act, Will gains strength and sends the divine torch towards Stagnate. Just as Stagnate blocks the attack, Blood strikes him from behind with his sword, and Will rushes toward him. Stagnate then tries to cast a spell, but Gus cancels the spell, and Will successfully stabs Stagnate with Overeater. Will pins him to the wall, and Stagnate curses him for being a despicable disciple of Gracefeel. Stagnate then promises to make Will pay for his act, but Will continues to strike him multiple times with Overeater. With the final strike, Will asks him to tell his mother Wagwan and destroys him. Afterward, Will says some prayers to his liege master Gracefeel and thanks his foster parents for giving him strength through the years of training. Blood, Gus, and Mary come over to embrace Will, and Gus suggests they party out their victory with the drink he's been hiding from them forever. However, Mary warns Will and Blood not to try their last drunken act again, else she'll show them who's boss. Will promises not to disrespect her like that again, and Gus goes to get the drink. However, when Mary and Blood try to stand up, they end up falling back to the ground, and Will gets scared for their safety. Soon after, Blood and Mary realize that they can't continue to live on as undead after losing their attachment. This fact upsets Will, and he breaks down in tears. Mary and Blood try to calm him down, but Will uses the opportunity to pour his heart out to them. He tells them how much he loves them and doesn't want them to leave him. He then begs them to stay, but Blood tells him not to be a selfish and be reasonable. Blood then advises him to keep himself company with some baddies while they are away, but Mary scorns Blood's idea. She then tells him to find love instead of getting ripped off by only fans and models, and also protect the weak from violence of all kinds. They both hug Will, and in that moment he sees their human form. Blood still has his bad haircut as a human, but Mary is very beautiful. Not long after, Gus joins them with the drink, and they all celebrate Will's victory and adulthood. Later that night, the holy light guided Will's foster parents back into the cycle of death and rebirth. The next day, Will visits their grave and bids them farewell as he proceeds on a new chapter in his life. Afterward, Gus comes to meet him, and Will asks him why he didn't choose death like Blood and Mary did. Gus then calls him an evil grandchild for wishing death on a poor old man, but Will continues to tease him. Gus then gives him his treasures and tells him to make good use of them. He then explains to Will that he had made a deal with Gracefeel to live for at least 10 more years until Stagnate regains his power. However, Mary and Blood didn't want that because it would make them greedy and reluctant. Hence, they chose to pass on. On the way back, Gus tells Will that he now has to figure out what to do about the seal, and also Gracefeel's future depends on his efforts as well. Will then turns to a money grubber and asks for money if he's to suffer such a huge predicament. Later in the day, Will dresses up and heads out of the temple. Outside the temple, Gus gives the last name Maryblood, which is a combination of his foster parents' names. Before leaving, Will decided to add Gus as his middle name, and he will go by William G. Maryblood, which still isn't as cool as Monkey D. Luffy. Gus then calls him a hopeless brat and bids him farewell on his journey. Many years back, before Mary and Blood turned into zombies, they were in charge of protecting the city from the High King. Blood engages in a battle with a demon and knocks it out easily. Mary then comes out to tease him and calls him a blockhead. They then start to discuss their battle plans to take out the High King, and how Gus's crew are taking care of their part. During their discussion, Blood tells Mary not to join them in the battle, but just like a feminist, she claims she's just as important as any other man. Blood, however, threatens to knock her unconscious and take her back if she continues to refuse, but Mary plays a dirty trick by threatening to unalive herself. Since no man can win over a woman's emotional blackmail, Blood gives in to her request. However, Blood asks for her hand in marriage if they make it back alive, and Mary accepts his proposal. During their walk back, they discuss their future family and how they'd love to have Gus tutor their kids. Blood proclaims to teach his son how to fight and use magic, but Mary teases him that he'll only end up being a strong, clever failure. They then talk about a name, and Blood brings up William, which means Helmet of Will. Hearing the name makes Mary feel at peace, and she accepts it as well. After he departed from the temple, Will faced many demons along the way during his journey, and surely the riffraffs weren't a match for the child of Blood and Mary. It has been a few days since Will left the temple, but he hasn't seen any humans around. only ugly-looking demons. This makes him wonder if humans still exist, and soon, he starts to feel cold. After continuing his journey, Will comes across an abandoned city and enters, hoping to see a couple of humans. However, the place is more or less a graveyard, and Will sees a large hole caused by a magic inference. He then prays to Gracefeel for the wandering souls in the city, and she guides them to the afterlife. In the night, he makes a tent for himself and eats dinner. However, he is now running out of preserved food and hopes he will reach a populated city soon. The next day, Will continues his journey and enters a forest. Suddenly, he gets attacked by an injured warthog, but he successfully unalives it with his spear. He then sees an arrow already lodged into Pumbaa's body and thinks it might have been attacked by a hunter. Then, a hunter appears with a bow aimed at Will, but Will decides not to make any sudden movements that might trigger a conflict. He sees the dress of the hunter and speaks the Elvian language to the hunter. After hearing this, the hunter lowers his bow and he turns out to be an elf. After a few conversations between them, they decide to share the boar, and after that, they share a meal by eating the liver together. To cook the liver, Will uses abracadabra to light a fire, but hides his magic ability from the elven hunter. As it cooks, Will prays to Gracefeel for providing such a wonderful meal, but the elven hunter finds his devotion quite appalling. After gulping down the liver like starving kids in Africa, Will asks the elf for directions. The elf then starts to get suspicious of him and asks where he is in front. Will withholds his true original and tells the elf he is from the south. The elf then assumes he is just an adventurer who's bad with directions and gives him the location of a small town. Just before the elf could leave, Will asks to follow him to his settlement, but the elf wasn't going to allow a weird stranger into his settlement. Afterward, he summons some fairies that will guide him back, and Will is amazed after seeing fairies for the first time. Will tells the elf his name, and the elf replies that his name is Meneldor. That night, Will thinks about his encounter with Meneldor, and he's grateful to have met him during his journey. He then decides to get some information about the town Meneldor told him about, before falling asleep like Snow White. In a dream, Gracefeel shows Will a snippet of Meneldor in danger, and Will quickly wakes up. He then traces Meneldor's footsteps using magic and finally comes across a small settlement. To his surprise, he sees raiders trying to attack some of the settlers, and he recognizes the arrows as that of Meneldor. It turns out that Meneldor isn't Robin Hood, he is just another raider. Meneldor commands his partners to sack the settlement and fires arrows at Will, which are easily blocked. The settlers then call for backup, and Meneldor tries to dip like a coward. However, Will double-crosses him, and Meneldor tries to disrupt his balance using his fairies. However, with brute force, Will sends the fairies flying, and Meneldor nearly shits his pants. Then, he sends fire at Will, but he extinguishes it with his sword. Will then leaps toward Meneldor and knocks him out with his spear. After capturing the perpetrators, the residents of the settlement start debating on whether to treat them like a sack of potatoes and skin them alive. One of the settlers, John, approaches Will and thanks him for his help. He then tells Will a brief history about their settlement, and Will asks what will happen to the raiders. John introduces Will to the village elder, Tom, and Tom also shows Will his gratitude. However, he asks Will if he is willing to protect the village, regardless of what happens, and Will swears on Gracefeel's light that he will. In the morning, Tom decides to question the raiders before passing his judgment. The raiders then tell them that their village was destroyed by demons, and those who ain't dead are severely injured. Meneldor then takes the responsibility for planning the raid and asks for the rest of his crew to be released. Tom sympathizes with them, but he has no choice but to unalive them by hanging. Although it is a smart judgment, Will remembers how he was taught to love others without fear and do good things. He then decides to overturn the hopeless situation by offering the settlement money in exchange for the criminals' lives. Tom then asks why he's going to such lengths, and Will tells him he can't leave a city overrun with demons because they're his archenemies. Also, he will need the talents of Meneldor to help him outside the demons, since he's a great hunter who has elite knowledge of the forest. Will then prays to Gracefeel for the millionth time, and glitters start raining down. After the criminals' ransom was paid, the settlement took in the wounded people who weren't involved in the raid, even though part of it was to use them as hostages. On the quest to find the demons, Meneldor can't figure out what Will is all about and asks Will if he thinks he won't betray him. Will then smiles and tells him his people will pay the consequences. Meneldor then agrees to work for Will, and they bid goodbye to the settlement. In the forest, Meneldor asks for their battle plan, but all Will had was to barge in like SWAT and jump the demons. However, they have to hurry the hell up because the dead people might have turned undead before they arrive. Will then decides that he needs to return to them to cycle before they end up lost and stuck in their wretched world. At night, Meneldor suggests they camp for the night and pray to the fairies to grant them shelter. Suddenly, the trees form a canopy, and Will gets excited like a child seeing a magic trick for the first time. During dinner, Will notices Meneldor is somewhat cold toward him, but Meneldor explains that he doesn't do well with people, and all he wants is to do his job and repay his debt. Meneldor then tells him he won't be fighting the demons with him, and Will Will agrees not to involve him. After dinner, Meneldor goes to bed, but Will still wants to chat in the moonlight for a bit. Meneldor calls him gay and goes to sleep, and Will is left with a broken heart. The next day, they continue their journey, but they are hit by a huge fog. Soon they arrive at the village, and Meneldor offers to scout the surroundings first. After scouting, he returns and gives Will a layout of how the ugly demons are arranged. The demons also have 2 commanders, and they are performing some bullshit ritual to their liege master. Meneldor also believes there is a demon beast in there, and tells Will about its structure. With his smarts, Will figures out it is a manticore, and he decides to head in and crush those bitches. While the demon performs their dumb-ass ritual, Will jumps them front behind and uses his magic to trap those far away from him. He uses his spear to unalive the demons and the manticore. Afterward, he sees that Meneldor has also unalive a few others with his arrow, and gives an excuse that he couldn't tell whether Will was winning. Just before leaving, Will decides to pray for the dead souls, and Meneldor just finds him creepy. Afterward, they scavenge the village looking for survivors, and soon they see an undead boy creeping out from under a pile of rocks. The boy seems to be close with Meneldor, and thanks him for coming back. Sadly, Meneldor refuses to take his hand because he's scared he might catch Ebola or something. Will, who is scared of any disease, holds the boy in his arms and calms him. Meneldor also takes the boy's hand, and Will prays for the boy's soul. As the boy's soul ascends, Meneldor apologizes to Will for thinking he was just some rich kid who happened to earn a master's divine protection and got cocky. Will doesn't mind him, and they both continue to guide the other undead corpses to the afterlife. A few moments later, Meneldor takes Will to the final location where a demon is present. They arrive at a house, and Meneldor calls out an old woman named Marple. Will sees her and realizes she's a high-ranked ghost whose soul is extremely tough. He then decides to use Overeater on her if she refuses to be exorcised, but to his surprise, Marple isn't senile. Meneldor then convinces her that it's time for her to leave and put the village in their care. However, Marple senses that something is going on with him since she can read him like a book. Meneldor then suddenly flares up and blames her for dying and leaving him behind. After his complaint, Marple consoles him and tells him to stop living like a useless bum. She also tells Will to keep an eye on him and treat him well. Maple informs Will that the demons that attacked them weren't a bunch of strays. They have a stronghold in the forest where their boss dwells and sends minions all over the place from there. After telling Will this information, Marple consoles Meneldor one final time before she leaves for the afterlife. A few days later, the villagers returned to the village, but they were shocked to see the state of their once beautiful village. They eventually gathered up their farm tools, started digging holes to bury the dead, and laid them to rest. Later in the evening, the villagers decide to have a party to mark their return to the village and also honor their fallen. They then start to dine and drink, but Will notices Meneldor isn't present at the party. Hence, he follows a fairy, and it leads him to Meneldor, who is brooding like a lost sheep. Will joins him, and they share the beautiful view of the sunset, and Meneldor tells Will about the undead nest. After hearing this, Will says he will go there the next day and return the undead to the afterlife. His actions never cease to amaze Meneldor, who is fed up with him at this point. Meneldor then tells Will about how his mother died after his birth and his rough childhood. Thanks to his ability to see fairies, he became an adventurer and made his way to Southmark. However, one of his party members poisoned him over some loot, and he nearly died. He managed to unalive the member but collapsed in front of Marple's village. Marple was the one who saved him, and at that time she wasn't an old hag. She nursed him, fed him, and also lectured him on how to be a good person. After she died, Meneldor got all the survivors together so they could steal, but they failed miserably thanks to Will. Will then looks at him with teary eyes, but Meneldor stands up and thanks him for saving the people of the village. He then asks on his knees to receive the Master of Light's divine protection, and Will acts as a medium between Meneldor and Gracefiel. Will prays for Meneldor, and Meneldor also swears to Gracefiel that he will atone for his sins and live his life facing forward. Afterward, they head back to the party, and finally, Will has made his first friend. The next day, the villagers begin rebuilding their homes like a bunch of termites. However, unlike termites, they're broke, and can't afford the basic materials to completely rebuild the village. Meneldor then suggests going to a port called White Sails to get some basic materials, and he tells Will a brief history of the place. As for the money to use, Will asks Meneldor to go with him to explore the ruins, and they'll split the loot 50-50. On the way back, Meneldor praises Will for being a seasoned scavenger, and thanks to him, they now have enough money for the village to rebuild and even buy livestock. Suddenly, they hear a scream and 2 individuals getting chased by a giant ape. The ape tries to take the man's luggage while a tiny elf throws rocks at it. Like the scene from Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes movie, Will engages in a stare down with the ape, but the ape is just a pusio, and it backs down. Afterward, Will approaches the little elf. but she's an annoying loudmouth. She introduces herself as B, and the man as Tonio. Will and Meneldor also introduce themselves to Tonio. Tonio then tells them he is from White Sails, and since that's where Will and Meneldor are headed, they make a deal with him to hook them up with a good vendor. In a different town, B turns into Celine Dion and starts singing while Tonio sells his goodies to buyers. Afterward, Tonio asks Will to use his power of healing to treat his injured customer, and as a form of gratitude, they buy materials from Tonio. Meneldor sees Tonio's tactics and calls him a great salesman. After a couple of healing sessions, B drags Will to the dance floor. The crew continued to pass through several villages, earning money in the same way as they made their way north for a couple of weeks. They then arrive at Wheat Road and decide to spend the night at a nearby barn. B then offers to sing them a song about the wandering sage, the war ogre, and the beloved daughter of Matter. Will eyes spark after hearing this since those titles belong to Gus, Blood, and Mary. For a couple of minutes, B sings about the exploits of the three heroes, and Will is happy to know more about his foster guardians. The story in the song takes place before they were known as heroes, and they traveled together. A certain remote village they visited was attacked by a wyvern, and a beautiful half-elf was chosen as a sacrifice to appease it. After hearing this, Mary suggests saving her, but Blood asks where they could get the money, while Gus says nothing. Suddenly, they heard a knock on their door, and after Mary opened it, she saw a little boy standing outside. The boy offers them some chump change that can't buy the cheapest meat, and Blood tells him they can't take on a wyvern for such a small amount. The boy then increases it with more chump change, and this time, Gus takes it from him and praises how shiny it looks. Afterward, the three decide to take on the wyvern, and with Gus's magic prowess, Blood's brute strength, and Mary's divine protection, they can bring the wyvern to its knees. After defeating the monster, they advise the boy and his elf girlfriend to leave the village. They gave the two lovebirds some protective gear, including a dagger, and told them to live the best they could and also make names for themselves. Hand in hand, the lovebirds made their way into the city, and the three heroes walk down the road in search of a new adventure. After B finishes the story, she tells Will that an elderly half-elf woman waits at a mansion waiting for someone who knows the heroes to come to her one day. Will then starts to cry, and B teases him for being a crybaby. The next day, Will trains outside, and Tonio decides to have a conversation with him. Tonio commends Will's fighting prowess and strength, but he asks Will what he truly desires. Will then tells him he wants to continue learning about the world, and he thinks among the things he learns, he will find what it is he wants. Tonio then proceeds to cook, and they have breakfast together. They all commend Tonio's cooking and scold Will for being only good at using weapons and also praying for bread. After breakfast, they head out to White Sails. On the way, Tonio informs them that a new ruler has taken over the Fertile Kingdom and he is quite incompetent. However, the king's brother, who was dispatched to White Sails, is a great wise man. His name is Ethelbald Rex Fertile, and he comes from a different mother than his brother, the king. Soon they arrive at White Sails, and Will is amazed at the sight of the large ocean. The crew enters White Sails, and Will is surprised that there was no inspection or toll. Tonio then explains to the priest playing tourist that the city ruler, Ethel, created that policy to allow goods to enter the city by boat in tremendous amounts. As a result, checking them during tolls and inspection can lead to the smuggling of both goods and people into the city. Ethel also imposed docking fees for ships and rental fees for companies setting up shop in the city to make revenue, keeping the movement of people and goods as unrestricted as possible. After hearing this, Will realizes that White Sails is a very advanced city, with a real sense of freedom, and not at all like the USA. Afterward, B drags Will into the city, and they start their tour. She takes Will to the market, showing him fashion accessories, and also a lamp used by apprentices to practice their light magic at night. Next up, they head to the public bath, and Will finally gets a clean bath after stinking up the whole place for a couple of days. Afterward, B takes them to a diner, and both Will and Meneldor gulp down the food like hungry lions. Will loves the taste of civilization, and asks them to continue filling his glass like a messed up drunk. After eating, they head to the temple, and Will asks them to wait outside while he pays his respects to Gracefeel. Inside the temple, Will approaches a priest and asks him where he can pay his respects to Gracefeel. However, since the followers of Gracefeel are uncommon, the temple is compelled to a certain prayer called Prayer of Faith Detection to vet Will. Sadly, the priests capable of this prayer have all been sent out to battle demon beasts, but the vice bishop is present. Suddenly, a grumpy old man walks to the priest and starts scolding him like he's got beef with him initially. The old man is Bishop Bagley, and after hearing his name, Will introduces himself to him as one of Gracefield's followers. To vet if Will is telling the truth, Bagley asks him a few questions, and Will's response gives him the persuasion he needs. He then asks the young priest to take Will on a tour around the temple before leaving to attend a meeting. During the tour, the young priest badmouths Bagley and calls him an old pleasure-seeking fool, but he praises the vice bishop as a virtuous man. In the temple guest room, Will asks for information about Bagley, but B tells him he's a vulgar person. Antonio adds that he has some influence on the city's commercial and industrial guilds. However, they hear the city's emergency alert, and they see that the city is being attacked by a Viwern. Within a few minutes, a lot of residents were injured and unalive, while the guards were dispatched. Seeing this upsets Will, and he rushes out to confront the Viwern. Outside, the temple was a mess, and the guards ain't doing much to the Viwern with their lame strikes. Will casts a lightning spell at the creature, but it misses. He tries to continue shooting, but Meneldor scolds him and tells him to be more efficient because he's fighting a Viwern. After the yelling, Will calms down and uses his childhood lessons as a guide to think of a way to bring down the monster. Soon, he asks Meneldor to help with his fairies and also instructs Tonio and B to work with the people nearby and get everyone clear of the temple's front garden. Meanwhile, Ethel watches from his castle and is deeply upset about his people dying like fleas. The plan begins and Meneldor summons his fairy godparents. Will then sends a giant lightning net at the Viwern, and the net traps the low-budget dragon. However, it breaks free from it and continues its rampage. The Viwern is pissed at this point, and it flies toward Will to fight him like a beast. Will then prayed earnestly to Gracefeel and used his divine protection to cover the temple. The Viwern spits fire at the temple, but it causes no damage. Afterward, it lands on the protective veil and spits black smoke, which ends up breaking the veil. Then, Meneldor uses his fairies to knock the monster to the ground, while Will binds it with magic chains. Yet the stubborn beast breaks the bound and is ready to roast them all alive. Will then jumps on the beast and gives it a SummerSlam, just like Blood taught him. Everyone witnessing the madness all have their jaws dropped, and B starts singing a bard about Will's feat. The people then start praising Will for being a hero, and not long after the news reaches Ethel. Then, Will and Meneldor lend a hand in fixing the ruined buildings. However, Will wonders what the black miasma emitted by the Viwern is, but Meneldor tells him to take his mind off that and enjoy being a Viwern slayer. As expected, Ethel sends for Will, and at his mansion, Ethel treats Will with utmost respect. Will also bows his head as he introduces himself to the Crown Prince. Ethel then asks how he was able to defeat the Viwern, but Will tells him he used brute force to break its neck. Through his response, Ethel realizes that Will feels no pride for killing a Viwern, and he is indeed a warrior of unparalleled bravery. Ethel then bows his head and thanks Will and Meneldor for protecting the city from the Viwern. He then asks if he wants anything as a reward, and Will tells him about the Mary of Demons commanding savage demon beasts in Beastwood. He then asks Ethel to send some soldiers to hunt down the demons, but Ethel tells him it will be difficult. This is due to the black miasma emitted by the monsters, and any living being it touches turns into a savage. After hearing this, Will asks him for permission to hire adventurers and mercenaries with his money, and organize an army to drive out the demons. Instead of granting Will his request, Ethel says he must consider the option of killing him instead, which leaves Will with a question mark on his head. After hearing the possibility of being murdered, Will almost wets his pants as he asks the prince how it would be done. Ethel says he would make it look like he was poisoned during his fight with the Viwern, and treatment arrived too late. Will quickly thinks of an escape plan, but feels that it is all pointless. He then decides to speak truly from his heart with talk no jutsu, and tries to convince the Crown Prince. Will then proceeds to tell the prince about his reception of the Gracefield's divine protection, and how he strongly believes that those who have her light should be the first to march into darkness. He then kneels in front of Ethel and asks him to grant him permission for the mission. Ethel responds that the mission will be full of despair, and he will pay the price whether it works or blows up in his face. However, Will says he kicks despair's for a living, and that forces a laugh out of the seemingly cold Crown Prince. Ethel then commends him for having a good friend because the elf was ready to go band for band with him when he threatened to kill him earlier. Meneldor acts like a tsundere and denies it ever happening. Suddenly, Bagley barges in, and the old geezer starts screaming at the Crown Prince for being irrational. Bagley claims that Will is a member of the temple, and that the Crown Prince shouldn't have brought Will to his chambers without consulting him first. Ethel feigns ignorance to taunt him, and Bagley continues to throw a tantrum like a 5-year-old. To shut Bagley up, Ethel tells him about Will's request to assemble a private army to save the poor people of Beastwoods from demons. As a result of that, Ethel suggests making Will a knight, which is called a paladin in their world, and he will share the responsibility and profits equally with the temple. The proposal seems pleasing, but Bagley demands he goes to the temple and thinks it over carefully. Afterward, he takes Will along with him, and they head for the temple. On the way, Bagley scolds Will for taking matters into his hands, but Meneldor defends his friend by telling Bagley he's not their babysitter, who tells them where or where not to go. Bagley and Meneldor then start to bicker like wives in a polygamous home, while Will uses the opportunity to try and rizz up Bagley's adopted daughter, Anna. Afterward, Will thanks Bagley Bagley for saving him from the Crown Prince through his intervention earlier, and Bagley badmouths the Crown Prince, but tells Will he will consider the prince's proposal. He then tells Will to remain in the chapel after the evening prayer, but Will the noob doesn't know what the evening prayer is, further frustrating the poor old bishop. After a few conversations with the bishop, Will discovers that there have been a few changes in the worship doctrine over the years, and because he learned the worship ways from a group of oldies, he wasn't aware. Bagley then asks Anna to assign a suitable teacher for Will, before walking away disgruntled like a lonely widower. In the temple, Will stares at the statues, and soon, Bagley enters. Bagley takes a moment to say his prayers, and Will notices that his praying form is identical to Mary's, which means he's an expert at it. After the prayer, Will asks Bagley why people think less of him even though he has received the divine protection of his liege master. Bagley then explains to the foolish novice that the liege master granted him divine protection to act through him. Hence, using the powers for personal convenience doesn't contribute to the liege master's glory, but only retracts from it. As the head of the temple, he must secure funding and rights by yelling and intimidating. To lay the groundwork, he must do favors and use bribery. If he used his divine protection for these, the people would be quick to judge why a disgusting man like him was granted divine protection. This is why he entrusted the vice bishop with the glorification of the liege master through blessings. This makes Will realize that Bagley is an amazing man, even though he looks like a greedy monk who's always complaining. Bagley then tries to convince Will not to give in to the Crown Prince's shenanigans because nothing good will come from a novice like him becoming a paladin. However, Will refuses, and Bagley labels him a fool. Bagley then asks Will why he swore to Gracefield, and Will replies that he swore to offer his life, banish evil, and save the suffering. A short moment of silence breaks out between them before Bagley tells Will to rejoice because he is the most dim-witted of all the dimwits he has seen. Afterward, Will and Meneldor go into a pub to look for suitable adventurers to add to their crew. Meneldor advises Will not to look for adventurers who do it for money, but to find those who do it for the fun of it. In the pub, the drinkers all recognize Will as the Vyworn Slayer, and they ask what his business is with the small folk. Will then pastes his request on the notice board, but after a few adventurers read it, they proclaim it isn't worth the risk since they're getting paid chump change. One of the adventurers tells those money-grubbing cowards to touch grass and asks Will what he hopes to gain from exploring the Beastwoods. Will then tells him he wants the demon boss, and the adventurer finds the mission quite daring, but fun. Afterward, he and his crew offer to join Will, and he introduces himself as Raystoff. At night, Bee makes another bard about Will's exploits, and Will tells her not to make songs about him in his presence. While Tonio calculates his business expenses, Will asks him to get them a nice deal for sick and injured people, as he can heal them with his powers. Tonio then calculates how to rip Will off using his abacus. The next thing to do is negotiate with Raystoff, and after hearing that Raystoff is in White Sails, Bee asks for an interview with him. In a diner, Bee tries to convince Raystoff to tell her about his heroism so she can write songs about him. However, Raystoff refuses the nosy elf and sticks to his belief that arrogance leads to a dull blade. Bee then expresses her frustration because Raystoff's heroic acts and missions are widely ambiguous. She then suggests a face-off between Raystoff and Will, and surprisingly, Raystoff agrees to the face-off. Will agrees to schedule it after they're done with their mission at Beastwoods, and Bee is excited at the prospect of writing an amazing song about the two warriors. The knighting ceremony arrives and Ethel names Will a paladin with the blessings of the vice bishop. After the ceremony, Will talks with the vice bishop and also thanks him for filling in for Bagley. Afterward, Will gets dragged away for more celebrations, and Bee tells him about all the profits they've been making due to the songs about him. Will is excited about this and asks Gracefield to keep watching over him. During their exploit in the Beastwoods, many things happened at a rapid pace. Will has set off with his army of ruffians to exterminate the demons infesting the beast's woods. For relatively safe places, they brought human resources and supplies, which are two things every poor village needs. Tonio also handled the financial part of their mission, ensuring the village pays off their debt and makes profits from their dealings. All these seem like a priest doing charity work, but Will knows he must continue to keep his loyalty to Crown Prince Ethel. During the mission, Bagley assigned a few priests, including Anna, to help Will. They were all experienced priests who could use the blessing, as well as lead ceremonies such as festivals and funerals. Also, when reports about demons arrive, Raystoff and the other adventurers pursue them as a party like the Ghostbusters, and bring some of their heads with them as a prize of battle. Subsequently, Will occasionally intervenes in any disputes between villagers like Mother Teresa, and tries to help them settle things reasonably. Word of his intervention spread like wildfire, and soon, he was called to intervene intervene in other villages' disputes, like he was the chosen one. His newfound profession was a bit overwhelming, but B helped him relieve some of the stress with her songs. This continued for a while, as they traveled back and forth across Beastwood time and time again, like the Paw Patrol. After a few months of rebuilding, the once poor village has become a place filled with joy and smiles. We'll then remember Gus's lesson on how money drives the world. And ain't that the truth? That day, Drystoff brings Will news about the possible disappearance of the party members who had previously gone to investigate demons. Will then decides to look for them, and Drystoff gathers a party of people who excel in forest exploration. During the search, Will brings up the possibility that the party was wounded and trapped in the demon's base. During an interaction with Will, Meneldor thanks him for helping him get through a sad part of his life. Soon, they come across the corpses of the adventurers, and a large hole probably made by the demon that unalived them. Afterward, they give the adventurers a befitting burial, and Will prays to Gracefield to guide their souls. They then notice that one of the heads is missing, and they follow a path left behind. Sadly, it was a trap, and they were surrounded by multiple demons. As a defense procedure, the adventurers form a wall, and Will strengthens them with divine protection. Meneldor also prays to his fairies for protection, but he gets attacked by a three-headed chimera. His fairies didn't do shit to help him, and Meneldor gets injured badly. Will, who's holding off a few other demons, tries to intervene, but he gets struck by a demon mid-spell. As a result, he gets hit by the lightning he tries to summon, and he kneels. While he is down, some demon snakes try to finish him off, but he uses Overeater on them, and it heals his wounds. Will then goes on a rampage and continues to butcher the demons with Overeater, and he continues to heal up as he kills them. The three-headed chimera sees this, and gets the hell out of there before it becomes toast. Will then kills the final demon, but he is about to lose his head. Luckily, Drystoff snaps Will's head out of his ass and tells him to quickly heal Meneldor because he's dying. Will rushes to Meneldor and prays to Gracefield to heal him. He then starts feeling lightheaded and eventually collapses beside Meneldor. A while later, Will wakes up and sees Drystoff. Drystoff then briefs him that they retreated after he and Meneldor got injured and the chimera fled. Will then tries to go see Meneldor, but he's too weak to move about. Drystoff advises him to rest for a while because he has used too much strength on the battlefield. After Drystoff leaves, Will starts to wonder where he went wrong and made a fatal mistake. After a little while of thinking, he overhears some of the party members talking about the incident in the woods. They talk about Meneldor suffering a fatal injury because he hanged around a monster like the Vyworn Slayer. Hearing them call him a monster makes Will understand where everything went wrong. Will realizes that it wasn't their battle tactics that were wrong, but the estimation of their strength. He truly believed in Meneldor and thought he would always have his back, but the reality is that he put Meneldor in danger he wasn't ready for. Will realizes that he is way stronger than everyone else in his party. He is like Michael Jackson, and the rest are Tito. While he walks dejected into the rain, he meets Tonio and B. B commends him for saving Meneldor's life, despite beating the crap out of multiple demons at the same time. B then calls him incredible, but Will feels that those who were with him during battle would certainly not feel that way. He then leaves them dejected and goes to see Meneldor. Tonio and B are surprised at Will's reaction and wonder what's going on with him. Ever since Will left the temple, he has been seen as a strong warrior, but he has always laughed it off. Subconsciously, he chose not to believe it, but now it is clear to him that he is the Gojo Satoru of this world. Will opens the door to Meneldor's room and sees him lying there with bandages all over him. Will blames himself for hurting Meneldor and then prays to Gracefield to heal him. All Will wanted was a friend who was also his equal, just like the friendship between his foster guardians. However, he was forcing that one Meneldor who isn't on par with him in terms of power and strength. This is because Will was afraid that if accepted that he was stronger than everyone else, he'd end up a lonely soul, just like he was in his past life. At that moment, Gracefield appears to him, and she seems worried. Will assures her that he has now found his purpose, which is to protect everyone and everything within his reach as her sword in hand. Afterward, Will leaves the room and locks the door behind him. A short while after he leaves, Meneldor wakes up and calls his name. Will attempts to go alone and fight the demons, but he is stopped by Meneldor. Meneldor calls him selfish prey for leaving them all alone and going into the demon's den. Will then tells him to stay back, because he is nothing but a drawback, and he won't be able to keep up. Meneldor and Will engage in a Naruto and Sasuke fight, only this one is one-sided. Will dodges all of Meneldor's punches and plays with him for a while, and then breaks his arm to stop him from acting out. However, Meneldor doesn't give up, and he uses his fairies to send rocks at Will. Initially, Will thinks of it as a dumb move, but he realizes that dodging the attack would hurt Meneldor. Meneldor then explains that he has no reason to stick with a coward who is acting out because he got his ass handed to him, but they're friends, and friends are supposed to be there for each other. Meneldor then calls Will his friend and promises to have his back at all times, and this brings tears to Will's eyes. Meneldor tells Will that he might be stronger now, but in a short while, he will catch up with him and show him that he's not a monster. Afterward, they return to their settlement, and Tonio asks Will for an explanation. After explaining the reason for leaving to them, Drystaff calls it the sickness of the strong, but they all assure him that they won't give up easily. Then, Meneldor suggests going back and kicking the butts of those demons in a revenge match, and Will supports it. Will then tells them that a chimera usually occurs as a result of a demon ritual, and the adventurers are ready to get their revenge on the monster. To sweeten the deal, Will increases the reward for ending the chimera, and the adventurers all cheer in acceptance. Indeed, there's nothing money can't do. After that, they spent a few days getting a force together, sent out multiple rounds of scouts, and made their preparations. Soon they head out with the party to the place where it all went down. At the location, Will gives orders to set up their gear, while Anna and the priests support them also. After they are ready, Will leads his army to the front lines, and the battle with the demons begins. Meneldor supports Will with his arrows, and the party members also lend the strength of their various liege masters. Will prays to Gracefield to protect them from the demon poisons, and they destroy the demons one after the other. During the battle, Will wonders how stupid he was to think he could take on the demons alone, and finally appreciates his army for having his back. Meanwhile, news of the battle reaches Ethel in his mansion, and he wonders if the campaign will create a victorious feat that would be sung by bards yet again. Bagley is also present in the mansion, and he keeps talking about how Will's failure will lead to him pulling the support of the temple. However, Ethel points out and teases him that his previous actions of sending his daughter and other priests after Will don't imply that he wants him to fail. At the battle scene, Meneldor and Will arrive at a strange location, but they're very careful of traps. Suddenly, Will casts a spell and unveils the chimera, which was about to use its invisibility to bait them. Will then asks if it is after the High King's seal, and the chimera is surprised that Will knows about that seal. The chimera tries to land a surprise attack on Will, but it is new to the game. Will stabs its ugly lion head with his spear, and chimera leaps into the air. As it charges, Will uses divine protection to divert it and stabs its wing. Meneldor also uses his fairies to sink its legs while Will continues to stab the monster. Will uses its multiple heads and reflexes to his advantage, and he attacks each head separately, triggering conflicting responses from the chimera. Meneldor also supports Will with his arrows, but suddenly the chimera gets pissed and starts emitting the black miasma. Will then tells Meneldor to attack a bit far away while he fights it head-on since he can't be affected by the poison. Will charges at the chimera and stabs its dragon head while Meneldor destroys the rocks beneath its feet. Will then leaps up and Meneldor pins the monster into the ground. Will then lands the finish by stabbing the lion's head in the face. After defeating the monster, they high-five and move on to the next challenge. They both enter the building, but find Raystoff standing above the corpse of the demon boss. They're both surprised Raystoff was able to beat them to it, and Raystoff demands his reward for defeating the final boss. The rest of the crew arrive thinking they were the first ones, and now imagine the dumb look on their faces when they see Meneldor and Will already present. As expected, Bee makes a song about their exploits after the battle, and this time she adds Meneldor's name to the song. Afterward, Meneldor and Will discuss their future, and Meneldor informs Will that the people have made a place of worship for Gracefield. Will is really happy to hear this because it is the first step into making Gracefield gain her following back. Also, Meneldor asks Will if he is ready to take over as the Lord of the Beastwood villages. This comes as a shock to Will because he doesn't know he is in charge of the welfare of those villages. The fool thinks he's just a paladin ordained by the royal family and the temple, who does good things out of the goodness of his heart. Meneldor hates to break it to him, but he is now the governor of Beastwoods, and he has the responsibility of overseeing their welfare. Will then breaks down due to the new predicament, but he gets up and asks Meneldor to help him. Since they're friends, Meneldor accepts his offer, and Will thinks that maybe one day, they'll be able to rebuild Southmark into how it used to be during Blood, Gus, and Mary's time. Will the redhead man is seen in an office running his hands over some papers, and suddenly a whitehead's voice interrupts him. He says he's over the moon over ordinary papers, but he replies that the documents are the town's future. Will and the whitehead walk along the street. The whitehead asks Will what he means earlier when he says the paper is the future of the town. He says if they cut down all the lumber around the city and sell it to white sales, the city will eventually run out of trees and die out. He says they need to diversify trades in the town, and in 10 years the city will be better. The Whitehead says our little hero thinks like an elf sometimes. The Whitehead says maybe that is why the Empress of Light chooses Will. The Whitehead says Will is in the middle of the front line, where he's prone to die at any time. He tells Will that the brother of the Crown Prince of White Sails summons them to the New Year ceremony. Will and Bee walk along the street, and Bee asks him if greeting every important person with a smile is easy. He replies to her that Manel did a good job with his outfit, and with all the help he receives from Bishop Bagley, he manages to pull it off. B says she would like to see Manel in formal clothes and asks Will where Manel is. He says he invited him to the festival, but he didn't show up because he was sleeping. Will stands on a bridge looking like a man who just lost his bride. B asks him what he's thinking about, and he says the forests around the Beast Woods are still very poor, and they have to work harder. She says he worries too much and tells him he doesn't have to do that. He tells her that he made a promise that he will be the Empress's sword to banish evil and be a hand to save the suffering. B compliments him for his benevolence, and she says it's very noble of him. She says he should try to please the Empress more. B asks him what he will do if the villagers bring him food to show gratitude, but feels scrawny and unsteady on his feet. He says he will tell the villagers to go eat the food. Will and little B walk along the icy woods. B says there is something she wants to see, but it's not the kind of place a lowly troubadour can get into. She asks Will if he can sneak in since he's a warrior priest and also a great sorcerer. Will stops and tells her about the academy, the school that sorcerers attend studying the words of creation, which is in the woods of the Forbidden Land. B says Will should be able to get them in with his brute strength. Will says if they try to force their way in, it will be raining blood. B feels like she has just seen a ghost. Will says it is set up that way to prevent anyone from sneaking in. Will says they can't sneak in, but they can just go up to the front door. B is so happy and shines her teeth like she's making adverts for a toothpaste company. They continue to walk along the woods and suddenly look lost, but Will uses the Nifronti Creed spell to clear their path. B says the wandering sage in his youth couldn't pass through this route on his own. They stand in front of a tree, and B says she feels like the ground is going to swallow her looking at the tree and wonders if it's a curse. Will says he can't sense any mana at work. Will looks deeper and sees a sign carved into the tree that makes him feel uneasy. They continue to walk in the woods and suddenly see an old man sitting next to a fire trying to stay warm. William introduces himself while B introduces herself too, and she asks Hiram for his name. Hiram says he's the academy's groundskeeper and says he's not worthy of giving his name to a paladin. B asks him if the academy is still far away, but he asks her why she wants to visit the academy. She says there is something she would like to see, and Hiram replies that the academy has rules that only sorcerers can enter. Will says they're just hoping they will allow them to have a brief look. Hiram offers them cheese to eat and says it will keep them warm. Hiram says he incidentally hears that the faraway paladin knows magic. Will affirms that he knows little magic. Hiram says as the academy's groundskeeper, he witnesses magic occasionally, but he would like to see what type of magic Will possesses. Will says he's unable to use his magic for mere sport. Hiram asks him if that has always been his stance. Will says that is what his master taught him, and he would like to uphold that. Hiram then asks him if he can help him get some firewood. William fetches some firewood and Hiram appreciates him for the kind gesture. Hiram asks them if great magic exists. What would it be like? B says it will be magic that brings people happiness. Our old MacDonald asks her why she believes that, and she says, because that's how Will uses his magic. Hiram is impressed with her response, and suddenly a bright light shines, and the gate of the academy appears. Will and B are happy just like the USWNT when they won the World Cup. Hiram, now wearing a different outfit, introduces himself as Hiram, a professor of the academy and the master of the woods. He asks B what part of the academy she would like to see. She whispers to him, and they walk into the academy. Inside the academy, B looks through the window and sees a robot clearing the snow. Hiram says it's a golem created by a previous master of forms. Will is so impressed with what he sees. As they walk through the academy, Will asks Hiram how he determines if someone has a talent for magic. Hiram says the words of those who have magic are powerful. Both their words of creation and the everyday words they use have the same roots. Hiram stops and says that the ones who make ideal sorcerers are often docile, easygoing, patient, and quiet. Will remembers that Gus, his master, has said a similar thing to him before. They arrive at a door, and Hiram opens the door for them to go in. Will and B see the bookshelf of the academy library and feel like they have just seen Mr. Beast. Hiram says they can visit everywhere in the library, but they shouldn't go downstairs. Will asks B if this is where she plans to visit, and she affirms. Will says he thinks B wants to see where the sorcerers learn so she can use it as inspiration for her songs. Will pick a book titled Introduction to the History of Magic. B finds some books and breathes like she's carrying a rock as she carries them because they look heavy for her. Will and B wave at Hiram as they leave the academy. As they walk along the woods, Will asks B why she picked those books earlier. She tells him a story of someone she used to travel with before she became a troubadour. She says the person was a hero, but after her death, she was forgotten by the people. B says she sings a song so people will remember all the heroes because they serve as hope for the people. Will asks her what she's talking about. She says just like Will, who fights for the people, that he's a sign of hope for them. She says Will is just like the first star that shines before darkness sets in. Will and Manel are seen fighting with demons. The demon attacks Will, but he blocks the attack with his shield. Manel defeats his opponent and takes its sword. He tells Will if the demons are the gatekeepers, then the Lord of the Forest is ahead, and they both walk through the gate. Menel says the big tree is the Lord of Holly that rules over the forest's winters. They walk closer and hear weird sounds. A voice asks them what has happened to the gatekeepers. Menel asks what he thinks might have happened. General Cernunos says that they must be Faraway Paladin, Sir William, and Menel'dor of Swift Wings. He says if the two celebrated heroes have come here, then they don't need to waste time. He summons the demons of the forest and says he will see to it that Menel and Will die. Will says a few days ago, on the summer solstice there are snowdrops blooming out of season, and the Crown Prince Ethel of Whitesails asks him to find out why it's happening. Menel says the entire forest region is ruled by two ancient trees, the Lord of Oak and the Lord of Holly. He tells William that the lords are twin brothers. Menel says the Lord of Oak rules from the winter solstice to the summer solstice. He says the Lord brothers yield the royal authority to one another at each solstice, keeping the 4 seasons turning throughout the forest. Will and Menel stand under a big tree. Menel speaks to the Lord of Oak and asks him why he refuses to transfer royal authority to the Lord of Holly. Lord of Oak replies to him that it is the Lord of Holly who has refused to accept the transfer of power. The Lord of Oak says his communication with the Lord of Holly has sliced through. He says the royal authority's power is great, and if it falls in the wrong hands, it will only foster the spread of evil. Menel asks Lord of Oak to entrust him with the royal authority, but he refuses. He says because Menel has human blood, it won't last a month before his soul will be destroyed. Menel says a month is enough time for him to resolve things with Lord of Holly. Menel says he vows to live, looking forward to atone for his sins. Suddenly a path opens and the Lord of Oak says, it's a secret rite known only to the forest, and Menel walks into it. Will is waiting for Menel to come out from the secret rite. He wonders what Menel is going through. Menel walks out of the woods and Will rushes to meet him. Menel shows him a bright inscription on his hand. Menel and Will stand while the forest demons surround them. Menel touches the root of a tree and summons Lord of Holly, and he bestows royal authority on him. General Cernunos says they will regret what they did. General Cernunos launches an attack at Will, as he summons flames and smoke from his hand. Will attacks him with his spear, but he blocks it and asks Will if he's human. Suddenly, a bright light cuts through General Cernunos and he falls to his knees. Will and Menel stand in front of a tree. The tree says he's the Lord of Holly, and he appreciates them for defeating the demons, and for the transfer of the royal authority. The Lord of Holly restores the forest. The Lord of Holly says Menel will be like him one day. He says since he has had the royal authority with him for some time, and now he's getting closer to being a vessel for a Lord of the Forest. He says there is something he must tell Will, and he asks Will if he knows the mountain rage to the west that its rocks have turned red. The Lord of Holly says soon the fire of black calamity will break out, and the flames will spread and may consume the entire land. He says the mountain is now the land of demons. The Lord of Holly says the land where the enormous Lord of Hellfire and Miasma sleeps. Will asks the Lord of Holly about the Lord of Hellfire and Miasma, but he tells Will to be prepared to fight. At the Palace of the White Sails, the Crown Prince apologizes to them for the stress he made them pass through. Menel says every time he puts them to work, something happens. The Crown Prince says if he sends for the Paladin Sir William, he gets a hero like Menel along with him. Menel says he's not a bonus from a stall market, and he says if he burdens someone too much, it breeds discontent. The Crown Prince Ethel says he will compensate Will generously, so he will stick around. Ethel says he will give Will money and whatever he wants, but Will says he should leave it for Menel. Ethel says he has a big favor to ask Will. He asks him if he can leave Menel with him, because he's a talented fairy user and also a masterful hunter. Will says Menel is not a property, and a man wearing an outfit that looks like a bishop interrupts them. Ethel addresses him as Bishop Bagley. Still in the Palace of the White Sails, Will talks about the fire of black calamity that will break out in the Rust Mountain. He tells them everything the Lord of Holly told him. Ethel says now they have to deal with the fire of black calamity and the Lord of Hellfire and Miasma. Bishop Bagley asks Menel the hunter what type of power the Lord of the Forest possesses. Menel refuses to answer him, and Bishop Bagley reacts like I do when my mom tells me to do the house chores. Will says the two of them should get along, but Bishop Bagley says Menel is an insolent brat. Bishop Bagley acknowledges Menel's talent, and Menel brags about his talent too. Menel analyses a map and says what the Lord of Holly tells them might be true. Bishop Bagley then says they have to treat the matter with high priority. Will says since they know where the problem is located, a desolate, hostile land where there's no fear of harming bystanders. Ethel asks Will if he will handle the situation, and he affirms. Ethel says they need to gather information, and Will says he will talk to Bee and the dwarf that lives in Torchport. Ethel says everything should remain a secret between the four of them. Will tells Ethel that he will take care of everything. Inside a restaurant, Will, Bee, and Menel discuss Rust Mountain. Will says he wants to learn everything about the place. Bee says it won't come free and asks Will what he will pay. Minnie makes a deal with Bee, and she agrees. Bee tells them the story about the Rust Mountain, which was known as Iron Mountain. Menel and Will walk along the woods. Menel chooses a path they should follow. As they walk along, everywhere is filled with fog. Will asks him if it's the right path, and he affirms because of the royal authority. They arrive at a torch port, and Will is impressed with how Menel uses the power he just acquired to move them so fast. At Torchport, a man hollers at Manel and Will. They discuss Rust Mountain, and the man says things have gotten troublesome. Manel says they are hoping the dwarfs might know something. Will asks the man about the immigrants that moved to Torchport, and the man says they have settled in. Manel remembers a year ago when the dwarf arrived and he said they would support them. The man says they should talk to Agnar, the leader of the dwarf. Will says he will speak to him in the morning. In a room, a demon is talking to little Will. The demon tells him the story of the lords of the sea and the lords of the forest, choosing to live long lives, and how others choose to live definite lives and die definite deaths as the human way of life. The demon says, those affiliated with wind, water, and trees consult Rhea Silvia, the empress of the forest, leading to the birth of the elves. He says the spirit of earth, stone, and fire long for human craftsmanship, so they consult Blaze, the emperor of fire and technology, which resulted in the dwarf race. Will asks the other demon to tell him more, but Blood says there is nothing to tell. Blood says the dwarves are good warriors, and they don't fear death. Will is seen sitting on a bed. He opens the door and heads out for morning training. Will is training outside with Manel. Manel says Will's look doesn't match his superhuman strength. He says Will is approachable. Maybe he's the best as he looks. Will says people seek what they don't have in others. Will spots a man hiding in the bush and asks him if he would like to see them train, but Manel scares him away. Will walks along the street and arrives at a restaurant. A bald man welcomes Will, and he greets the man and apologizes for visiting him without notice. The bald man introduces Grendir, his grand-uncle, and the leader of the immigrants who just arrived. Will tells him that he serves Crown Prince Ethelbald Southmark, who has entrusted him with governing Beast Woods. He asks Grendir why they've come here, and he says they have come to die. Will was shocked like he just heard a gunshot and spilled his cup of tea. The bald man says his grand-uncle is one of the last survivors from the mountains to the west. Grendir says he dreams of a day when they reclaim the mountain again. Grendir begs Will if he can make his dreams come to pass, and Will says he will do everything he can to help them. Grendir says that 200 years ago, a monarch lived in the Iron Country. He's of short stature and frail constitution. He did not excel in the martial arts and preferred to write. His name was Arvangar, the last king of the Iron Country. The land was blessed with prosperity and well-being, and when a storm came, led by the High King of the Eternals, when the fires of war encroached upon the Iron Country, an emissary of the demons appeared and said they should follow the High King. It causes commotion among the people, but Arvangar says he will make the decision, and he stands up and cuts off the demon's head. He says he will go to war against the demons, and he won't let the Iron Country be destroyed. Grinder weeps and says amid the bitter cold and the treacherous path, his child passed away. He appreciates William for his efforts. Will walks along the street. He monologues about Arvangar, the king of your own country, and wonders what is the dragon. He arrives at a shop and sees men beating a man. He interrupts them and says he thinks they've had too much to drink. The two men look like they're going to pee in their pants at the sight of Will, and they both apologize for causing a ruckus. The man wakes up looking jumpy as a cat on a hot roof. Will asks him what his name is, and he says his name is Rue. Will says he's happy that the man didn't get injured after taking so many hits. The punch bag for the drunkards says his toughness is what gets him going. A lady walks in and Will asks if she's the owner of the store, and he apologizes for what happened. The lady says her father is sick and she couldn't stop them on her own. Will asks her if he can examine her father. The lady is surprised like she has just seen a snake and says she can't make such a request of Will. Will says if he knows someone is ill and he does nothing, the Empress will fly off the handle with him. Will goes into the room with the lady and heals her father. Both the lady and her father appreciate Will, but he says they should appreciate the Emperor of Light who gives him power. They come out of the room and see Rue fixing the door that got broken earlier. Will is impressed with how he could do that in a short time. Will and Rue prepare to eat, and Will asks Rue why he is here in the city. He says he just moved to the city hoping to find his bearings. Will says that's not a big deal, but Rue says others from his clan are getting busy. Rue compliments Will and says he's nothing like him. Will says he can be like him too if he eats well and trains too. Will says dependability comes from your conduct and getting used to things. He says there must be a reason they both have to meet like this, and he asks Rue to help him as Thane. Will says if there is anything Rue wants to do, he will support him, but Rue says he might cause him trouble and says he would like to learn from Will. Rue and Will walk along the street at night and see people gathered. They all yell at the young master at the sight of Rue and say they've been worried, but now that he's back, they're glad that he's safe. Will interrupts them as he introduces himself to them and apologizes that he is the reason Rue comes back late. One of them says Will is the paladin and very strong, but with scars on his face, says Will is not only strong, but he can crush every one of them here. The man introduces himself as Gelrice and says he accepts Will's apology on behalf of their young master. He asks Will why he has come to them. Will tells him he would like to make Rue his Thane. They are all surprised like I was when I saw Speed. A man grabs Rue and says being Will's Thane is too dangerous. Will asks Rue for his decision, and he tells his people he wants to learn from Will. He says he wants to be someone he won't be ashamed of. Rue kneels before Will and asks him to accept him as his Thane. Will says he will guide him with his own hands the loyalty that Rue offers him. Gelreis tells Rue to serve Will faithfully, and he tells Will to take care of their young master. Inside a room, Will tells Rue he would like them to talk about his pay. Will says there is more to being a Thane, but he will pay him and provide his equipment. Rue says he's happy to serve him and doesn't deserve pay. Will says someone once told him that money is important, and it's a sign to show that he appreciates his efforts and loyalty. Will and Rue jog along a path. Rue is panting like he just ran a cross-country race. Will asks him if he's okay, and he affirms, and Will says they can go another lap then. They finally arrive at their destination. Will tells Rue to do some light walking to catch his breath, and then they'll start muscle training. Rue gnashes his teeth as he holds on to a tree branch, sweating like a chilled Pepsi. Will stops him, and Rue asks him if he will have to do this every morning. Will says they will have to work on other parts of his body too. Will says he wants to do some practice swings later to check Rue's footwork and body movements. Will introduces Manel to Rue, and Manel apologizes for scaring him off the last time. He tells Rue that Manel will join him in his training sessions from now on, and Rue appreciates Will for his guidance. Will and Gelreis walk along the street. Will asks him what he was doing at the pub, and he says they ask him to supply meat for a celebration that will happen in 10 days. Will asks him if he's a hunter, and says he's a mercenary, but he can handle crossbows and traps too. They stop, and the man looks at the people, and he tells Will that it's a beautiful city. The dwarf with a scar face tells Will that he was once a warrior for the Iron Country. He says to uphold their king's last command. They took their weapons and worked for many different employers. He pleads with Will to give Rue the best guidance he can. Will vows to do his best to give Rue the right guidance. Will taunts Rue about his strength, and suddenly, Will flips him over like a sack of sand. Will says getting used to pain is part of his training. Rue asks Will how he managed to pull that move earlier. Will calls Manel to come practice on him so Rue can see it. Will seals a letter inside his office and thinks the letter should get to Bishop Bagley. He remembers what the Lord of Holly tells him about the fire of Black Calamity and what Grendor tells him about the demons. He thinks about everything and says he's scared. Menel's voice interrupts him and he looks through the window. Menel yells at Rue and says he's wet behind the ears just like Will. Menel asks if he's going to run away with his tails between his legs. Rue charges at Menel and hits his helmet, but Menel feels like he has just been hit with a wool. He asks Rue if that's all he can do. He taunts Rue and yells at him to keep hitting him. The training continues and Will watches from the window of his office and suddenly Rue hits Manel. Manel compliments him for his efforts and tells him to keep it up. Will discovers Rue is getting stronger with each round of combat. Inside the house, Rue looks tired just like I feel after playing soccer for 3 hours. Will gives him food, but he says he's not sure he can eat, and Will says all his training will be a waste if he doesn't eat. Rue asks Will if he knows about his background, and Will says he could guess. Rue says he's from a noble family and tells Will the story of how his parents passed away. He says the people of his clan protect him from all hardship, and he wonders if that's the right way to live. Rue says after he listens to a song about Will, that is when he wishes he could be like him. He says serving Will now is like a dream come true, and he's so elated about it. Will appreciates him and says he will do everything to be a worthy master to him. Will and Rue sit inside Will's office. Suddenly the door opens, and Raystoff says he's back. Will asks him about his journey, and he says nothing seems out of place. He asks Will if he should report his findings to Anna, and Will affirms. Raystoff walks towards Rue, and says he heard about Will's new Thane. He examines Rue, and tells him what to do. He introduces himself, and asks Rue, who is about to pee in his pants, for his name. He asks Rue what he thinks about Will, and he says he has great respect for him. Raystoff tells him not to harm Will's reputation as his master. Raystoff tells Rue to be confident, and he asks Will if it's okay to talk to Rue. Will says he plans to ask for Raystoff's help though. Raystoff tells Rue he will be butting in his training soon. Will and Rue are training, and Rue flips Will over. Will compliments him for a good job, and suddenly a lady interrupts them. The lady gives a report to Will about the undead, and she apologizes that things like this happen. Will says he gives priority to matters involving the undead. Will says he's going to handle it, and asks Rue if he will accompany him. Rue is over the moon, and says he will be honored to go with Will. Will and Rue walk along the woods. Will says he heard dwarf eyes can see even in darkness, and tells Rue not to rely too much on his sight. He asks Rue where they're heading, but he blabs rubbish. Will says the main reason for their journey is the fog, even though no one knows if it's due to geography or a magical barrier. They arrive at an eyrie, and Will takes a look at it. Rue exclaims like he has seen a ghost. Will takes a look and tells him it's just a gravekeeper. Will says he thinks someone is just seeing things and assumes it's the undead. Will tells Rue about the king of the undead who can't bear to see people die miserably, so he grants all dying creatures the right to overturn tragic deaths. Rue says Will seems to know quite a lot about an echo of death and asks if he has met anyone before. On their way back home, they discover a door and open it. It looks like a tunnel, and Rue says he can't see anything. Will uses his power to ignite light on his spear, and also ignites a fire on a wood and gives it to Rue. They continue to walk into the tunnel and arrive at an entrance. They walk through the entrance and suddenly get a strange feeling, and Rue feels like he is finally going to lose his life. A voice comes from a raven in the dark and welcomes them to her place. She tells Will it's been 2 years, and he immediately recognizes that it's Stagnante. Will tells Stagnate that defending is not an option here, and she says if they fight now, she will lose. Stagnate says she's not an Echo today, and Will says Herald, and she affirms. Stagnate says after taking her through WrestleMania the last time, she won't be able to send Echo to the world for a while. Will realizes he has been tricked, and he takes the bait. Stagnate says regular fishing is despicable from the fish's point of view, but that's just how the emperors are. Will says he doesn't think Stagnate has come for revenge for the last time. Stagnate apologizes that the echo she used the last time misbehaved at its dying moment. Stagnate tells Rue that Will killed her. Will says he's not aware that emperors have a fondness for jokes and asks her what she wants. Stagnate praises Will, and suddenly her eyes turn red, emitting a great force that makes Will fall on his knees. Stagnate tells Will that he will fight the dragon, and he will die in defeat. Will groans like he has been shot with an arrow. She says if he doesn't want to die in vain, then he should not fight the evil dragon Valasurka. Will asks her why she's telling him this, and she says she likes humans, and finds the radiance of their souls to be beautiful. She says that's why she desires undeath and eternity for them, and she will hate to see Will get killed by Valasurka. Will says he's surprised the virtuous emperors employ Valasurka. Rue asks her if Valasurka is a remnant of the age of the emperors. She affirms and says Valasurka remains a mercenary, including during the uprising led by the demon and Abyss. Will says the cataclysm of 200 years ago, the end of the Union Age. Stagnate says Valasurka was hired by the demon army and caused the fall of the Rust Mountains, and then falls asleep because his battle wounds were too severe. Rue asks her if she means battle wound by his ancestors. Stagnate affirms and asks if he's a survivor of the Rust Mountain. Stagnate flaps her wings and vows to tell Rue the truth. She says Orvanger, the king of the Iron Mountain, was a true hero, and says that Rue should be proud. She says Orvanger took an eye from Valasurka, who survives from the age of emperors. Rue falls to his knees and weeps like Christian Pulisic after losing to Uruguay at Copa America. Will wonders why Stagnate is suddenly being so good. Stagnate says Will may surpass Orvanger's great achievements and succeed in slaying Valasurka. Suddenly the whole place shakes like when the Turkey earthquake happened. Stagnate says the dragon's sleep grows shallow and that the dragon has just shown his power. At the Eyrie, Will and Rue are seen fighting demons, and they defeat them all. Stagnate says, this is the cry of the dragon. Will says the overwhelming might of a ruler strikes fear into all living things. Stagnate tells them that something troublesome will come along with the dragon, and Will might likely struggle with it. Suddenly a forest giant appears to them. Will says they're a mild-mannered race, and Stagnate says he has been hit by the dragon's roar, and he's not in his right mind. Stagnate asks if Will is going to kill the giant, but he says no. Will charges towards the giant and flings him to the ground. Rue feels like he has just seen the angel descend. Will looks at the giant and points his hand at him saying, shine the light of reason up the fog of confusion, and a bright light shines. The giant wakes up and apologizes for what has happened. He introduces himself as Ganger of the Jotun and says he will forever be indebted to Will. Rue says this is his first time seeing a giant, and Will says it's his first time too. Rue wonders how Will can speak the giant's language, and he says his magic teacher had immense knowledge. Stagnate interrupts them and says, that is the power of the ancient dragon that even the demons fear. Stagnate says, should the dragon awaken, then Will has no choice but to defeat him, and he can't do it alone. Will asks her if he has to accept sacrifices for the cause. He says even though Stagnate is his enemy, that doesn't seem like something she'd say. She says as long as Will is alive, more people can be saved. She tells Will to think about it, and she bids him farewell. Rue says they seem partial to Will, and Will says they have their eyes on him. Rue says the Emperor wishes for heroes to make their divine will known, and Will is the hero that symbolizes the Empress of Light. Inside William's office, he uncovers a letter from Bishop Bagley and reads that the dragon is accompanied by high-ranking demons, and says Will can't defeat them on his own. Will feels devastated. Manel knocks on the door and enters the office. He asks Will if he's wrestling with himself again and doesn't notice anything. Manel tells Will to look outside and that they've got a bit of trouble. He looks through the window and sees the dwarfs. They say they've come to ask him what his intentions are. One of the dwarfs asks him if he's going to slay the dragon because failure to do that is a sin that falls upon dwarfs. They all say they're willing to accompany him if he's going to slay the dragon. Rue tells them the dragon is a formidable foe. One of them tries to go into the building and Rue flings him over. Grendir acknowledges Rue's strength and says they've always wanted to die while fighting alongside the Orvanger. He says the 200 years of wandering have been so long, and they can finally fight now. He says Rue should let him in, but he flings Grendor over and the dwarfs pounce on Rue. After a moment, Rue addresses them and vows to take the Iron Mountain back, but they have to give Will time to make a decision. Will opens the door and says he will slay the dragon. The dwarfs feel like they just heard the roar of a lion. Will says he has made up his mind to slay the dragon. He compliments Rue for his proclamation. Menel says they won't need numbers to fight the dragon, so it's just going to be Will, Rue, and himself. He says they will need a guide to take them through the journey. Gelrace volunteers to be their guide. Raystov says he will go with them too. Menel says they're just 5 going against the dragon and the demons, and Will says they're at a disadvantage. Bee runs and hugs Will, and she asks him if he's going to fight the dragon, and Will affirms. Bee says then she can write a song about it just like she promised. She says she will start by spreading the prequel far and wide. Will appreciates her, and she bids him farewell. Will sleeps and dreams about his empress, and she empowers him and tells him to go and slay the dragon and fulfill his promise. Everyone gathers and wishes them well as they all embark on the journey to slay the dragon. As they continue to sail, Will spots a fire and says they will disembark here. They got down from the boat and met some men. Will walks up to them and a man holding a lamp says they will take it from here. Rue asks about the identity of those men. Will says, since they begin their journey, the demons will be on the move too, so Marcus and his men will try to distract them while they go upriver. Will says, once they enter the tributary upriver, they will be able to reach the mountain from the other side. He says while the demons are waiting at the front door, they will kick down the back door and enter with force. Menel uses his magic to get the winds behind them and accompany them as they continue their journey. They board the boat and move at a steady pace. Rue looks restless like a man whose wife is in labor. Menel tells him to be calm and that Will always does stuff like this as if it's natural. Rue says there is a lakeside town that the High King took over, and it's very dangerous. He says even veteran adventurers are helpless amid the swirling mists of magic. Will says that's where he grew up, and everyone exclaims, still sailing through the river at dawn. Rue asks Will if the 3 heroes still live there as undead. Menel says Will cries when he listens to the song about the 3 heroes. They sail through a fog, and Gelrace asks if this is the maze fog. Will says it's his grandfather's magic, and Raystov asks if it's the higher version of the maze alley magic that protects the academy. Will says he will make a path through the fog, and he makes an inscription that says, through hardship to the stars. All the fog clears off, and they continue to sail towards a deserted area. They arrive at a deserted city. It looks like a battle royale ground. Will looks at the mountain from a distance, and Menel tells him to go on. Will runs towards the mountain like a cheetah hunting its prey. He arrives at the top of the mountain and yells for blood, and Mary saying he has come home with his friends and companion as he kneels. He enters the temple to look for Gus, his master, but he can't find him. He turns around and suddenly sees a face that terrifies him. Gus asks Will if he has made a lot of money, and Will says he didn't even care to say he's alive. Gus says he knows the boy he raised together with blood and Mary won't die easily. Will says he's the lord of the entire downstream region now. Gus says he's impressed Will got so far in a little time, at such a young age. He asks about Will's love life, and asks if he's just wussing out. He says he wants to meet his great-grandchild before moving on in the cycle. Gus yells at them saying they want to go and fight the Valasurka the dragon. He asks Will if they're going to finagle Valasurka. Gus says the Emperor's hired Valasurka to work for them, which means they can resolve everything with money and goods. Gus continues to yell at Will and says he doesn't have to limit himself to one solution. Gus welcomes everyone and says they should make themselves comfortable. Gelreece walks up to Gus and says he never expected to see him again. Gus asks him where they met before, and Gelreece says he's the soldier Gus and 2 others saved 200 years ago when he flees from the mountain. Gelreece says he didn't know Gus was the wandering sage. Gus says he is aged, and Gelreece affirms that he appreciates Gus and says it's all thanks to him, and now he can serve a new ruler. Will is inside a room and sits on the bed when Manel walks in through the door. Manel says Gus is something, and Will says he thinks she will say Gus is more lowbrow than she expected. Will says he's proud to call Gus his grandfather. Manel says he asks him if he's the bandit girl. Gus is seen cleaning the house using his magic. Will walks up to him and says he would like to have a word with him outside the temple. Will asks Gus to tell him about Valasurka, and Gus says he has never seen him before. Gus says he would like to bargain with Valasurka if he has a chance. Gus tells Will if he wants to fight Valasurka, then he should aim for his old wounds. Gus says he's not sure blood could cut through the scale of the dragon. Will says what about Gus's words of obliteration? Gus asks Will if he knows why the true dragons can fly quickly despite their sizes. Will says because words travel through the air. Gus says the dragons live within myth and are closer to words than those who live today. He says if it comes down to the battle of magic, that Will is going to lose. Will says he's at a disadvantage in a magic battle against the dragon then. Gus continues to tell him about the dragon. Gus says if Will should engage in a physical battle with Valasurka, he's got him beat in muscle. Gus says the best strategy to slay Valasurka is to ambush him, but Valasurka is likely going to use the demons as a warning. Will says now he understands why Stagnate tries to stop him. Gus says Stagnate thinks like other emperors and he shouldn't keep up with them. Gus asks Will if he's going to die, and Will says he made up his mind to fight no matter the outcome. Gus says there is nothing he can say again. Will asks him about how he killed the 3 wyverns. Will asks Gus if he remembers the boy and half-elf girl he lent money to. Gus says he remembers. He asks Gus if he can collect the money in his place. Gus says he won't let William die then if he's going to collect his debt. He says the equipment that the comrades used to battle the High King still rests in this city. Inside a small hut, they all look like fools trying to figure out where the weapon lies. Gus uses the delusion magic and a door appears. Will looks surprised and says he didn't know there was a door there. Inside the basement, the dumbasses are thrilled at the sight of the weapons. Gus says they should take whichever weapon they like. Will finds a shield and asks Gus if it was used by blood, and Gus affirms. Restov says he doesn't need anything because he can't put his trust in weapons he's not used to. He asks Gus to engrave some words on his sword so it won't detract from his usability. Menel brings a bow and shows old Gus, and she asks him about its owner. He says it belongs to Telperi and the Silver String. Gus asks if she can use it because if someone unworthy uses it, they lose their fingers. They all find nice weapons for themselves. Will presents a dagger to Rue, also known as Al. He takes it and Manel asks about the dagger and says the hook is on the wrong side. Will says it's a right-handed stiletto. Al asks him who the dagger belongs to, and he says it belongs to his father. Al freaks out like he just stepped on a naked wire and says he can't accept it. Will says he feels the dagger is better off in Al's hands. Will tell Al they should clean up the kitchen before others arrive with food. Al says he feels like he has dragged Will into his problems. Will says he knows he has to fight too, so it's not Al's fault. He says if he abandons this now, he will not be able to face his parents or Gus again. He says when he returns to the Empress of Light one day, he wants to be able to tell her that he lived the best life he could. Will says he wants to fight the dragon, and thanks Al for helping him make that decision. Manel arrives with a deer. Manel serves Gelrice and Rastov their food, and she says they shouldn't feel bad that they didn't catch a fish. They all laugh, and Will says great warriors are not always great fishers. Al asks Manel how he's able to kill the deer. She says she conceals her presence and walks into it, and she fires at the deer. Rastov says Manel just got lucky, and luck wasn't on their side. Manel tells Rastov to agree he sucks at fishing, but Rastov says it's just a fluke. William lies in bed and remembers what Marion Blood said to him when he was little. Will goes to the grave of Marion Blood, and he tells them he's home. He tells Mary he has made some friends and appreciates Blood for what he has been able to achieve. He stands up to leave and finds Gus behind him. Will tells him he will leave in the morning. Gus says Valasurka is a warmonger through and through, and that Valasurka can only survive amidst the chaos of war. Gus says it's unlikely Will can avoid a fight, and the only one who poses a threat to Valasurka is him. Will says right now he's not strong enough, and he will be an easy obstacle for the dragon to overcome. Gus says Will and his friends will die, and if they survive, someone else will die. Will says Al, Manel, Rastov, and Gelrice are all prepared, and none of them have intentions of dying. Gus tells Will that his only chance of slaying Valasurka is now before his wound is fully healed. Gus says he wishes he could go with him to help him out. Will says it's okay, and tells Gus to wait back with Marion Blood. They leave to fight the dragon. As they continue to sail, Menel uses his magic to make them sail faster. Will holds the map and asks Gelrice if he has any idea what they might find ahead. Gelrice says he knows nothing beyond the Great Collapse. He says before the Great Collapse, there was an elven forest to the west of the Iron Country called Lotdor. Menel says some words and Will asks him what he's saying. He says it's a travel song known throughout his homeland. Gelrice says the song brings back memories even though Iron Country doesn't have a good relationship with the elves of Lotdor. Gelrice says skirmishes between their peoples grow violent at times, and sometimes there is only hatred between them. He says they excel at song and spirit arts, yet they are proud, ill-tempered people. Will asks what happened to the Lothdor during the Great Collapse. Gelrice says the Lothdor secluded themselves in the forest and resisted. Gelrice goes to pieces as they approach a dry forest. He says it looks like the river's flow has changed in 200 years. Menel says it looks like a deja vu, and Will says that's a word of taboo. Menel says if the elves seclude themselves in the forest, no one can do anything. He says the demons use the words of taboo to rot the entire forest. Will says they have to destroy them, and Menel says they can't let the demons live. Suddenly there is a strange feeling, and they all grab their weapons. Serpents of the sea attack them. Will and Rastov cut off the heads of the serpents, and Will tells Manel to sail them at a faster speed. The boat sails at a slow pace, and Will tells Manel to focus on the incantation, while Restov and Gelreis take the port side. And he tries to cast a spell, but a serpent grabs his hand and tosses him into the river like yesterday's newspaper. Will goes deep inside the river, and suddenly a bright radiance emits from his body. He fights the serpents and defeats them. He floats back up and climbs on the boat. He casts a spell and blasts off all the serpents in the river. Al the naive Thane asks Will why the water suddenly turns clear. Will says it's just a prayer of cleansing. Al says he thinks something like that can only be done in a small pond. Menel says Will brute forces things and Al should get used to that. Restov says the river has swallowed up the forest and the change in terrain here is a problem. Al asks Gelreis if he sees anything that looks familiar and he says no. Al spots stairs under the river, and Gelreis says it is the style of architecture of the Elven. Restov says they should not use any powers around here so they don't have to catch the demon's attention. Will brings out the paddle, and they continue to sail. As they sail through the woods, some hands like that of a zombie pop out of the river and grab their boat. Menel asks Will if they're enemies, but he says no, that they're just in pain. He summons Gracefeel, Empress of Light, to grant them peace and guidance. The Empress of Light appears and shows them the direction to go. Menel casts his spell again, and the boat sails faster. As they approach the bright light, they hear a noise. Menel jumps out of the boat. They run along the woods and see Menel fighting with a Hydra demon. Menel grabs a lady and continues to run as Will attacks the demon with fire. They strategize how to defeat the demon. Will attacks it with fire, while Restov cuts through it with his sword. And Gelreis and Al combine to slice the Hydra. Al asks if they've defeated it, but Gelreis says Hydra's poison cannot be neutralized by everyday miracles. Menel hollers at Will and says the lady has been bitten. Will tries to heal her, but she says the Hydra's poison is too deadly, and she can't be healed, but begs them to save his people. Menel tells her to let Will heal her and tells her to pray while he does that. They continue to sail along the river. Menel touches the mouth of the lady he saved earlier with a bottle. She freaks out and asks him what he's doing. The arrogant dumb says he's waking her up with an intense kiss. Menel asks her how she feels and says some gibberish. She yells at him and he says it's a sign that she's feeling well. Menel apologizes to her and says he wasn't brought up well. He introduces himself and the lady introduces herself as Dinalind of Remarath, the swift-winged eagle of the Silver Moon. Menel says elf etiquette is not his thing and says she shouldn't let him say more than that. Dinalind introduces herself to Will and appreciates him for saving her life. Dinalind wonders how the five of them plan to slay Valasurka. Will asks her why she takes on a Hydra in a place like that. She says it's a long story, and Menel interrupts them saying they should grab something to eat first. As Dinalind tries to eat, Al says he thinks elves don't eat meat. She says the only elves who don't eat meat are those who have undergone great training to enhance their spirit qualities. Dinalind says, do they not have some inkling as to what she was doing at that place earlier? Menel asks if it's because a proud elf can't abandon the weak, and she affirms. Menel says that even if there is not enough food to support themselves, elves never cast the sick or elderly aside. He says the young and healthy ones who can fight voluntarily leave their community instead. Dinalind affirms and says that banishing those who are weak is unthinkable. Will asks her if she can show them to her village and also show them how to get to the mountain. Restov says it looks pretty bad here in the forest. Menel says there's more than just demons' words of taboo at work. Dinalind says it's the evil dragon's miasma. She says it defiles the forest, degrading it year after year, as if it's necrosing. She says there are more strange beasts. Al says the dragon is supposed to be in the mountains. He wonders how the miasma got this far. Dinalind says through underground tunnels built by the dwarfs. They arrive at Lothdor, and people are seen looking sick, like they've been hit by a biomedical disease. Dinalind says the power of the Fae has weakened through the region, and the water, air, and food are poisoned. Dinalind says the days when it was a beautiful land of flowers have long passed. She says they never imagined heroes would come from outside to slay the dragon. Inside a temple, Will asks the leader of the Fae if he can allow him to heal the critically ill people. Will heals the leader of the Fae's cough, and he is so surprised at what Will has done. Will tells him to gather the ill people, and he's going to heal them. The leader of the Fae says healing will affect Will's vitality and concentration. Will says if it's 100 or 200, it won't be a problem. Will heals them all. After a moment, he tries to take a rest as he heals himself too. Stagnate perches on a tree and asks if Will is using a poison-neutralizing blessing to sober up. He says this is the enemy's territory, and he can't let his guard down. Stagnate asks about his journey, and he says it's going well. He suddenly hears a sound and holds his head, and Stagnate says it's a warning from Gracefeel. She says Gracefeel truly loves Will, and she asks him if he will let her love him too. Will says she should stop with her jokes. Will asks Stagnate why she has come, and she says she has come to warn him. She says if he wishes to turn back, this will be his last chance. Stagnate says if Will attempts this now, he will die. He says if he flees, the dwarfs and Al are going to die. She says many will die when the dragon finally awakens. She says many thousands will die, human and elf alike. Stagnate says the damage the dragon caused to the people will bring more followers to Will and his empress, Gracefeel. She says many warriors from all around will fight alongside Will, and Gracefield would have regained her power, and he can earn her blessing. Stagnate says that Will's blade will be able to reach the dragon's throat. Will says he can't do it, and Stagnate asks him if he's desperate to save everyone. Will says he understands everything Stagnate says, but the moment he accepts her proposal, his promise and faith will both be broken. He says Stagnate has made a sound argument with the hope of breaking his spirit and bringing him to her side. Will says she will continue to be Gracefield's sword in hand. Stagnate says she has failed to persuade him again. She says Will has turned her expectations on their head. Will says he never sets out with the intention to be a hero. Stagnate says Will discovers his weakness and makes it his reason not to give up or lose heart. She asks Will to be her right hand so they can defeat the dragon, take down all heroes, and destroy all emperors. Will says he won't be swayed by her invitation, and she will continue to be his enemy. It's dawn, and Will opens the door and sees Manel and Dinalind arguing. Dinalind says it's true that the elves of Isel have no principles. Manel says he doesn't want to hear that from a keep-it face-to-face Remarath elf. Will says it's just a lover's squabble, and he turns back to go inside the room. Manel and Dinalind stop him and ask him what he just said. He gulps like he has swallowed an ice. Dinalind says they have no time to waste on love affairs. Menel says if it isn't for a time like this, Dinalind is pretty. He says dropping a compliment or two whenever he sees her is just good manners. Dinalind yells at Manel and says he's an Ectokako Niragamos, and Manel calls her an Onomok Nag. Manel says he wants to go to the Lord of the Forest, but Dinalind is trying to stop him. Will tells Dinalind that Manel can be trusted, and she says she trusts the two of them. Dinalind says the area around the Lord of the Forest is Demon Beast territory. She says she won't let Will or Menel go to the forest and fight a battle when she knows they're going into another one. Gelrice says the elves have not changed, and Will asks him what they should do. He says whatever he wants them to do. Will asks Menel if he knows the forest, and he says he can sense it. Will tells Gelrice to get Al and Raistov and tell them to prepare fully armed. Dinalind asks him what he's talking about, and he says Demon's Beast extermination. As they walk along the woods, Dinalind says the demon beasts who've made the Lord of the Forest's throne thief turf are insect types. Al spots one on the tree and smashes it. Dinalind looks up and sees the purple moths, but Menel shoots his arrow and kills the moth. Menel heals the Lord of the Forest, and the whole forest comes back to life. Dinalind says if the dragon and the demons find out about what just happened, it will be bad for them. Will asks Dinalind to show her to the nearest underground tunnel that leads to Rust Mountain, where Valasurka lives. Dinalind says they will follow him, but he says they can't go with people who will slow them down. She leads them to the west gate of the Iron Country. Will asks Al to knock on the door, but Al, who looks like he's going to pee in his pants, asks Will if he's sure about it. He knocks the gate and it opens wide. Suddenly a great emission comes out through the gate, but Will uses his strength to stop it. Dinalind asks Will if he's going to go against such a power, and he affirms and says that's why they've come, to reclaim the mountain and reclaim peace. As they walk through the gate, Dinalind stops them and vows that the elves will return the favor Will has done one day. Will, Manel, Raisto, Al, and Gelrice are walking into the mountain. They notice that the air is stagnant. Raisto asks Will to cast a spell of poison resistance on all of them. Will tells them that they are there to fight demons. Some crawl on the walls while some are on the floor, so they need to be focused. They continue to move, and suddenly Menel asks them to stop, that there's a trap, and he will disarm it. He runs forward to it. Will asks Gelrice if he knows where they are, and he says they should be coming up to the Hall of Stone. Menel calls them to start coming, that it's all good now, and they continue their journey. They notice that they were not attacked by any demon, and Al says, that doesn't mean that the dragon and the demons are not a monolith. Menel says that maybe they're all assembled in the Hall of Stone and are waiting to ambush them. They all suddenly wait, and Menel puts his torch to the front to look at what it is. He says he hears something like the sound of clanking metal and footsteps coming and going. Will steps forward and says he and Gelrice will go in first with their shield up. He asks Menel to back them from the corridor, and Al with Raistov should stand by. Will and Gelrice move to the down and open it suddenly. To their surprise, they see a group of dwarf warriors. Al moves forward to talk to them. He introduces himself as Vindalfer and that he carries with him the blood of Aurvanger, the last king of the Iron Country. One of the warriors says that the Iron Country has not yet fallen, so his grandfather cannot be the last. Al looks at the walls and says that the wall is well built and renovated. One of the warriors says that it is the pinnacle of their technology, and they will not allow the demon to enter their country. Al says that despite all of this, the Iron Country has fallen. All of the warriors died, and the great king Aurvanger also died. Lothdor has tragically withered away, and the iron content is now the Tust Mountains, where a dragon and demons lurk. He reminds them of how his grandfather stuck out one of the dragon's eyes, and it was a heroic act celebrated by the emperors themselves. He says he has committed himself to carrying out his grandfather's heroism alongside the heroes of the present day, and as well as Gracefeel, the Empress of Light. He swore to bring back the Iron Country's former prosperity, and the Rust Mountains would be the Iron Mountains once more. Who makes pain-in-the-ass promises about rebuilding nations? He moves closer to them and asks them to rest for now, that they've done enough. They all answer and fade away, leaving their armor on the floor. Gelreis tells Al well done for what he did and says they should proceed to drive away the demons. Gelreis promises to protect Al, even if it costs him his ancient life. Al says there is still much he wants to learn for Gelreis, so he's not going anywhere. Al tells Will to command so they can continue their journey. As they are about to continue, the demons run out to them and they all start to slay the demons to the last one. They start to run to the great cavern beyond them with the hope that the dragon is there. Menel says that he imagines the demons will be waiting to intercept them in the Hall of Light. It is the throne room where the great king Ovanger delivers his last speech. He says they have to be there in time. Raisto says that everything that was stolen should be taken back. On getting to the throne room, everywhere looks like a place where a disaster just happened. The whole room is scattered and some of the pillars are broken. They see someone sitting on the throne in front, and Al asks if that isn't General Scarabaeus. He moves to Will and asks him to let him handle the man. Will refuses, but Al insists, and he moves forward to him like a king who is going to battle for his throne. Gelreis says he did not like the look on the general's face, and Manel asks Will if he is going to let Al die for some warrior's hang-up. Will tells LOL them to calm down and that they will still have a way to intervene. As Al gets to the front of the general, he screams out loud and plenty of dragon bats start to fly in to attack them. Menel shoots at them and screams at Al that if he can't handle the situation, he should just stay alive until they win. Al says that he will beat him and he will win. He charges toward the demon and hits him with his blade, but to no avail. Within a twinkle of an eye, the whole room is filled with demons of all kinds, looking hungry and ready to devour them. They all start to slay the demons, and Al is trying to defeat the demon he's fighting with. The demon throws him to the pillar and ties him to it. As the demon is getting close to him, Al says that he will not lose, and that his vow is the hope of his brethren. He breaks the pillar and jumps out of the captive. He cuts off the demon's hand and throws the demon to the ground. He stabs the demon and tells the demon that he will take back what he has stolen from them. The demon groans in pain, and Al cuts off his head. Al breathes heavily and announces that he has defeated the enemy. Some demons come into the room, and they slay them all. Menel says that he thought they were all dead meat when he saw all the demons that came after them. He says 5 of them charging into the demon's base is reckless. Menel hugs Al and tells him well done. Will picks up the crown and gives it to Al that he took the mountain crown back, but Al refuses the crown. They notice that General Scarabaeus' body is gone, but his head is still on the floor. Gelreis says that the demon's body turns to dust when they die. Will says that they should track him, and they notice that he's heading towards the Great Cavern. They get at the Great Cavern, and they start to search. Suddenly, they see General Scarabaeus' body without a head, and they keep wondering what he's doing there. He hits the ground and turns into a mighty ugly-looking dragon. Will, Menel, Raisto, Al, and Gelreis are seen standing. The whole place looks like a place where 2 elephants just fought. Valasurka calls all of them weak and then makes his eye shine like a bulb. The very giant, ugly-looking Valasurka welcomes them to his bedchamber. Valasurka asks for their name and says they're destined to die. Will remembers what a girl told him inside the temple that he may try to deny feelings like fear and anxiety, but it won't make them go away. She also says that what he needs to be confident is not pride, and to be courageous is not false bravado. Still at the scene, Will breathes in and out and gets the courage to ask for Valasurka's name. Valasurka thinks Will is a lowly rabble who merely seeks to plunder and goes on and on to praise himself like a king. He finally says his name is Valasurka. Will also starts by mentioning all the names of his ancestors and praises himself before he finally mentions his name. Valasurka laughs at him and says that the name gives him nostalgia. He says they might have been allies if they'd reached out to him before Valasurka did. Valasurka says that he detects a faint hint of Valasurka, of the undead scent on Will. Still at the scene, Valasurka asks them if they want him to be their servant. They all look surprised like they've just seen a ghost. Valasurka tells them that since they've all destroyed Valasurka, they are also a danger to him, and that is inconvenient. It will be wise of him to depend on them. Valasurka looks at the treasure and says he has an ulterior motive, but he will seek appropriate compensation. Valasurka also says that he does not wish to fight a brave warrior like them. Will says that he knows that Valasurka will kill him in the future, destroy everything, and change his loyalties. Valasurka laughs and says Will is correct, and says it is not a bad deal. Will thinks to himself that if he accepts, he won't have to fight a losing battle now. Valasurka asks why they want to fight him. He says it is because they perceive him as a threat to innocent people. Will. Valacirca lowers his head to them and says he's not a threat. He asks them to make their choice. Either they choose peace or a battle resulting in their demise. Still at the scene, Will continues to breathe heavily and feels a hand on his cheek. He mentions everyone's name and says the outcome of the conversation will decide everything. They all nod in agreement to him. Still at the scene, Will says that Valacirca will be the one to choose, not them, and yells at Valacirca to mend his ways of his extreme enthusiasm for constantly scheming and seeking conflict. Will says that if Valacirca can mend his ways, he will ask the Empress of Light to protect and also defend him from others who want to harm him. Valacirca scatters everywhere again, saying that Will has successfully answered his riddles. Valacirca calls Will a reckless boy flourishing his strength for a lark because he thinks he's cunning for the sake of pretending his own life. The Valacirca also says that Will walks the path he considers to be righteous with valor and wisdom, and acknowledges Will as a true hero. Valacirca says he refuses to choose to change his ways. He brings out fire from his mouth. What is a dragon without this? They all stand and keep looking at Valacirca as he continues to praise himself. Valacirca tells them that he can kill them there and add another new page to his terrifying history. He then asks them to challenge him and fight him. Will swings his spear and runs towards Valacirca and wants to aim for Valacirca's old wound, but stabs his scale instead. They all also aim at him and say that Will is not the only one he's fighting. Valacirca then brings out fire from his mouth to Will, but he blocks it with his shield. Valacirca also scatters the floor and tells others that they have nice teamwork. They all use their power to defeat Valacirca, but all to no avail. Then Will ties, knot, and bind Valacirca with chains. Valacirca is trying to break through, then Will calls out Gus's specialty. Valacircus remembers that it is the trump card that burned into his eyes in the past. Will sends it to him, and it forms a round figure around Valacirca in the chain, and it rolls into the ground and creates a very big pit. They all move to the pit and see nothing inside. Al asks if they have won the battle, and Menel answers him that it looks like it. Gelreis says that the moment of victory is surprisingly unsatisfying. Will still did not feel certain of the victory of destroying Valacirca. The wind starts to blow from inside the pit, and blows all of them away. Will stands up and sees that the dragon has transformed into a bigger one. Valacircus tells him that with the word of obliteration, he can erase even him if his aim is true. Will then starts to think of a way to defeat Valacirca, because Valacirca has fought all kinds of battles and has won. Will is seen standing in front of the giant, ugly-looking dragon. Still at the scene, Valacirca commends Will for his bravery in fighting him, and says he wants to offer him a proposal. The foolish Valacirca asks Will if he is interested in serving him, and if Will refuses his offer, he will burn down all Will's companions' bones and souls to ashes. He then tells Will to cut off his head if he wants to end calamity, since the next world awaits him, and has an infinite chance of going to other worlds. Will tells Valacirca that he won't choose any of his choices. Valacirca asks Will if he will fight him and die. Will tells Valacirca that he cannot bow to him. Valacirca threatens him that his companions will die. Will tells Valacirca that they all came prepared for that possibility, and as long as one of them survives to put a blade to Valacirca's throat. Valacirca tells Will that they have no chance of winning, but Will says they do if he hits Valacirca thousands of times with his blade. Then Will screams out Valacirca's name and tells him he will slay him. Valacirca says he will strike him before he can do that. Will runs towards Valacirca and sees that Valacirca is bringing out his hand to catch him. He climbs Valacirca's hand and stabs him on his head. Will aims at Valacirca the second time again and stabs him in the neck. Valacirca feels the pain again and throws him away. Will realizes that his spear has broken, and he brings out another spear to aim at Valacirca. Valacirca sends fire to Will where he is, but he uses his shield to protect himself. Then Valacirca sends his breath to him, and Will flies back to the ground, and everywhere is in chaos. Valacirca says to Will that he knows the spear he is holding, and he is familiar with the spear. He also says that Will has proven himself worthy to die by his breath, so he will hold his image in his memory forever, but he will burn Will's body and soul down to the last bone. A voice comes from the sky that he will not allow that to happen. Valacirca looks up and sees a flying bird descending. The bird then says that Will is her prey and enemy, and she won't have him defeated by another creature right in front of her. Valacirca immediately recognizes the bird and calls her the Empress of Undead, Stagnate. Will uses the second spear to stand himself up and looks up to see Stagnate. Stagnate says that Valacirca is right by saying that the intervention of a mere herald from a single emperor changes nothing. She also says that is the prophecy she gave Will. that heroes are insufficient, and Empress of Light on their side are still insufficient. They stand no chance of slaying the evil dragon El, Calamity's sickle. She says she did not consider what the intervention of the two emperors could be. Valasurka asks Stagnate if the heroes have a chance of winning, and she says they would have at least some chance. Then Valasurka says that Stagnate is as loquacious as ever. Stagnate replies that the two of them are two of a kind, a detestable kind, and that they have similar tastes. Valasurka says that his taste is not as bad as Stagnate's taste, and asks Stagnate what's the point of living forever. Stagnate says that beautiful things should last forever. Valasurka calls Stagnate a lady killer as she flies from the rooftop. Valasurka tells Will that two Empress rushes to his side when he is in peril. Will wonders who the second Empress is. Stagnate perches on his left shoulder and says it doesn't matter whether she is an emperor or an empress. That gender is only decorative, and tells Gracefield that perches on Will's right shoulder to not be angry. Will looks so confused as to how the two ladies can be on his shoulders. Stagnate says she will regret not intervening after seeing such a furious battle. Valasurka says that they will have to intervene in his fight for a reason, and he calls them hero-obsessed hedonists. Stagnate says that Will is worth going mad for and flies up to meet Valasurka. She asks him if he still has the will to fight once more. Will points his arrow at Valasurka and asks him if he remembers when he says he is about to see how stubborn he can be. Valasurka laughs sarcastically and says that Will is indeed dreadfully stubborn, and commends him that he is truly a hero. Valasurka tells Will that the Emperor has given him their utmost blessings and protection, allowing a man and a dragon to stand as equals. He says burning the heroes down is what makes him a dragon, and he spreads his wings as if he wants to fly just to praise himself. He asks Stagnate what protection she will give to Will and how she will kill him. Stagnate says that she has no reason to protect Will since he is her enemy. She reminds Valasurka that he is in the Iron Country, the mountains where the regretful souls of the Warrior of Flames reside, and she says now is the time to return, because his compatriots and descendants have come back and have brought back an undeniable hero to defeat the demons, challenge the dragons, and take back the mountains they call home. She asks Will to take up the sword of vengeance and set the flames of courage ablaze once more. She calls out the dwarven undead warriors, and a troop of warriors runs out from the mountain. Valasurka sees them and laughs out loud in a wicked way. Will asks Manel, Raisto, Al, and Gelrice if they have become undead. The stupid four that have been on the floor forever finally stand up. Menel and Gelrice say that they're alive. Al says that the solo battle distracts the dragon, and Raisto says that with the protection of their ancestral emperor, it takes a while to heal them up since he's not used to it. Will asks Al that when he was fighting the demon, he earned the divine protection of Blade, the Emperor of Fire. Al says yes and asks Will why there are plenty of undead warriors. Will says that they're their allies, reinforcement they can rely on. They all look so surprised like they've just seen a ghost at the sight of Al's grandfather, and they bow down to him. Al's grandfather stretches his sword to Will, and Will says, shouldn't he be giving it to Al instead of him? He looks back at Al, and Al nods to him to collect the sword. He walks forward and collects the sword. Gelrice calls the sword Caldon, an enchanted sword handed down among the dwarfs since the Age of Emperors, and the blade that took one of Valasurka's eyes. Al's grandfather tells Will to take care of his grandson in the mountain, and he starts to burn. Al runs towards his grandfather, and Raisto says that Valasurka's flames burn everything up, even souls. Still at the scene, Gracefield flies down and says it is not over yet, and stops Al's grandfather from burning. Gracefield tells the one who cannot preserve their soul, and the ones who have been burned by the dragon's breath and cannot return, to the cycle of rebirth. She bestows upon them her final blessing. She says even in death, and even after their souls have perished, they still wish to pursue what is good and right. She says she would guide them, and ask them to gather under the heroes who live in the present day. She picks all the souls of the undead warriors, and sends them to Will, Manel, Raisto, Al, and Gelrace. Still at the scene, Al's grandfather stretches his hand toward Al, and begs him to look after their country and all of their people. Al says he will look after them, and that his grandfather should count on him. They both shake hands, and his grandfather's soul disappears into him. Stagnate looks at them from the mountaintop and says that Gracefield will not let her have all the fun. Valasurka says it seems all 5 of them are ready. Valasurka says that once they have made their preparations and gathered all they need, they should all come for him and he will crush them. Menel pulls his string, Al raises his sword, Raistov also raises his arrow, and Gelrice raises spears and aims at Valasurka. Valasurka screams that they should challenge him. He brings out fire from all parts of his body, and continues to run his mouth on how he's going to kill them. Gracefield tells Will to slay the dragon and keep his promise. She calls Will her knight. At the battle scene, Will raises the called-on sword to Valasurka, and says that on his sword, on the light, on the souls of the warriors that dwell within his chest, he will slay the evil dragon. All the undead warriors scream that evil should end now. Valasurka roars and everywhere starts to shake. Will runs towards him and he sends down light to him. Will calls for divine protection of light and it protects him from the fire. As Valasurka is about to hit Will with his hand, Will aims his horn and cuts off one of it without any chill. Valasurka makes the ground swallow Will's leg so he can't move. Valasurka tells him that he will crush him and makes the ground swallow Will. Everyone else looks so scared and yells Will's name. Restov says that Will has grown accustomed to his movements, and he runs toward Valasurka. Menel shoots his arrow at Valasurka, and he screams out loud. Menel says that the arrow comes with a bonus gift of Hydra venom. Restov then cuts off one of Valasurka's legs, and Gelry screams at the warriors to fire. They all fire and run towards Valasurka. Valasurka hits his other leg on the floor, and they all stop and defend themselves. Valasurka brings out fire from his mouth, and says he does not want to do what he is about to do because it will also harm his treasure. Will realizes that if Valasurka breathes that thing out of his mouth, then it is over. He then calls for maxima acceleration and flies up to Valasurka. Valasurka's mouth starts to shine like a sunrise. Everyone opens their mouth wide in shock. Will falls to the ground, and Valasurka releases his breath on him. Will says, if he is done with the dragon, then it is fine by him. Gracefield tells him not to give up. He stands up and rushes to Valasurka and stabs him. Valasurka screams out loud again in pain. Will says that he will not give up on life until the very head, and he holds on to the sword on Valasurka. The breath starts to burn his body after it has burned his clothes, and everywhere becomes white. At the fighting scene, Manel, Raisto, Al, and Gelris rush down to where Will is and start to shout his name for him to wake up. Will wakes up and sees them. He tells them that he's fine. They ask him not to get up yet, but he refuses and says he feels really good for some reason. He looks at where the dragon is and sees him lying lifeless on the floor with his 2 swords beside him. He sees the undead warriors and the 5 of them thank them for saving all of them. Gelris bids them farewell and that the young master and he will take over from where they stop. Al says he will restore the Iron Country to its former glory, and they all disappear. Will looks at his hand and says his body seems weird. Menel says that he knows how many times he was turned into a charcoal. Will says he doesn't mean it that way. He picks up a piece of stone from the ground and breaks it with his hand. They all looked so surprised. Stagnate says that he sucks up the dragon's life force through his demon blade, and his body and soul were burned red hot by the dragon's breath, and that Valakurka's dragon factor has interwoven itself deeply into Will's body and soul, that ordinary blades can no longer cut him, and weak words will feel like no more than a light breeze. She also says that the state does bring about an increase in one's animal nature. She advises him not to let the power make him arrogant, but he should make every effort to keep the dragon factor quiet, and if he does not do it, it will bring him to ruin. Stagnate starts to shade off, and she says she carelessly uses her power, but as she helps him slay the dragon, she says Will owes her and is indebted to her. She says that Gracefield guides those dwarf warriors away. Gracefield comes back and Stagnate bids her farewell. Gracefield asks Stagnate if she will not consider giving up on her idea since it's not too late. She asks if Stagnate will discard his undead powers and work with her to guide souls once more. Stagnate instantly says no and that she will follow her ideas. The 2 sisters bid each other farewell. Stagnate tells Will that he is now shown more brightly as a hero and he has acquired more power. She says that as light grows, so does darkness. She says that he should avoid becoming war-crazed and detesting people and keep his womanizing in check. Someone who doesn't have a woman. Stagnate turns into a very beautiful lady and dresses like a princess. She says that she loves Will and then she fades off. Manel tells Will to be happy. Gracefield says that Will has done well by slaying the dragon and says she will reward his efforts. She asks him to request anything he desires. Al asks if it will be possible to expel the evil dragon's miasma from the area around the mountain, including Lothdor. Gracefield says that now that the dragon is gone, the request can be granted to an extent. Al asks that she should purify their homeland. Menel says that he will join the request, and Gelry says that he will also join the request for the sake of his fallen compatriots. Raisto says that he is also fine with the request. Gracefield grants their request and purifies everywhere. She prays for sorrow for those who have been lost, blessings upon those who are born, peace, prosperity, and joy in the land. She also prays for the heroes who have slain the evil and reclaimed and restored the land, that may the blessing of the light be with them always. Will it move closer to where the dead dragon is and closes its eyes? He asks them to clean up the place and head home. They decide to celebrate and invite the people of Lothdor to play music for them. They pack up the place and take a few of the dragon's scales and his treasure as proof of their conquest. They return to town. While walking in the woods, on their way to town, Dineland runs to them happily and asks if they're safe. Isn't that obvious? She says she heard the dragons roar and suddenly, all went silent. Then a strange fire spread and the entire area was cleansed. At the party, they all dance happily. Dinalin tells Manel that she thinks he will not return. Manel says that he still has the stuff to do, like rebuilding the party ground for starters. Raisto says that there are still surviving demons. At the party ground, Will meets with the elders and tells them that he will give them the dragon's treasure so they can use it to rebuild. Gelrice and Al walk up to them, and Al says that, now that the mountain is free, the former residents of the Iron County will surely return as well, so they should work together to restore their land to its former prosperity. Menel says he will drop by the forest where he was born and ask for skilled people to come to help them, and Dinalin offers to follow him. Will, Manel, Raisto, Al, and Gelrice are seen inside the boat. They come to meet Gus, and as soon as he sees them, he asks them that they didn't die, and notices the flow of Will's mana. He says it's odd, like a dragon factor. They both go to his parents' grave. He bends and tells them he's home, and thanks them for saving him again. Al returns the weapon Gus gave him, and Gus says he should continue to use it. Will wants to return the sword Al's grandfather gave him, but Al tells him to continue to use it also. They move to another town to tell them about their defeat of the dragon. Everyone is so happy about the news. The following day, they celebrate their victory with a party. I hope you guys enjoyed the recap. Like and subscribe for more recaps, and don't forget to turn the bell icon on to not miss out on new updates. As always, thanks for sticking to the end of the video.